Dianetics, the original thesis, by L. Ron Hubbard. Introduction. In 1932, an investigation was undertaken to determine the dynamic principle of existence in a workable form, which might lead to the resolution of some of the problems of mankind. A long research in ancient and modern philosophy culminated in 1938 in the heuristically discovered primary law. A work was written at that time which embraced man and his activities. In the following years, further research was undertaken in order to prove or disprove the axioms so established. Certain experiences during the war made it necessary for the writer to resolve the work into applicable equations, and an intensive program was begun in 1945 toward this end. A year later, many techniques had been discovered or evolved, and a nebulous form of the present refined work was formulated. Financed chiefly by a lump sum disability compensation, that form of Dianetics was intensively applied to volunteer subjects, and the work gradually developed to its present form. Dianetics has been under test by the writer, as here delineated, for the past 4 years. The last series of random volunteers, numbering 20, were rehabilitated, 20 out of 20, with an average number of work hours of 52 per subject. Dianetics has been found to successfully resolve migraine headaches, ulcers, arthritis, astigmatism, bursitis, stammering, glandular imbalance, asthma, allergies, and other psychosomatic ills. It has also successfully removed any compulsions, repressions, neuroses, and psychoses to which it has been applied. L. Ron Hubbard, 1948. Part 1. Discoveries and Principles. Chapter 1. Primary Axioms. Dianetics is a heuristic science built upon axioms. Workability rather than truth has been consulted. The only claim made for these axioms is that by their use, certain definite and predictable results can be obtained. The principal achievement of Dianetics lies in its organization. Almost any of its parts can be found somewhere in history, even when they were independently evolved by the writer. There are no principal sources, and where a practice or a principle is borrowed from some past school, the connection is usually accidental and does not admit any further use or validity of that school. Dianetics will work, and can only be worked, when regarded and used as a unity. When diluted by broader applications of older practices, it will no longer produce results. To avoid confusion and prevent semantic difficulties, new and simplified terminology has been used, and is used only as defined herein. Dianetics is actually a family of sciences. It is here addressed in the form of a science of thought applicable to psychosomatic ills and individual aberrations. The field of thought may be divided into 2 areas, which have been classified as the knowable and the unknowable. We are here concerned only with the knowable. In the unknowable, we place that data which we do not need to know in order to solve the problem of improving or curing of aberrations of the human mind. By thus splitting the broad field of thought, we need not now concern ourselves with such indefinites as spiritualism, deism, telepathy, clairvoyance, or, for instance, the human soul. Conceiving this split as a line drawn through the area, we can assign a dynamic principle of existence to all that data remaining in the knowable field. After exhaustive research, one word was selected as embracing the finite universe as a dynamic principle of existence. This word can be used as a guide or a measuring stick, and by it can be evaluated much information. It is therefore our first and our controlling axiom. The first axiom is survive. This can be seen to be the lowest common denominator of the finite universe. It embraces the conservation of energy and all forms of energy. It further delineates the purpose of that energy so far as it is now viewable by us in the knowable field. The activity of the finite universe can easily be seen to obey this axiom as though it were a command. All works and energies can be considered to be motivated by it. The various kingdoms have this as their lowest common denominator. For animals, vegetables, and minerals are all striving for survival. We do not know to what end we are surviving, and in our field of the knowable and in our choice of only the workable axioms, we do not know and have no immediate reason to ask why. All forms of energy are then surviving to some unknown end for some unknown purpose. We need only to know that they are surviving, and that as units or species, they must survive. By derivation from the first workable axiom, we come into possession of the second. In obedience to the command survive, life took on the form of a cell, which, joining with other cells, formed a colony. The cell, by procreating, expanded the colony. The colony, by procreating, formed other colonies. Colonies of different types united, and necessity, mutation, and natural selection brought about specializing, which increased the complexity of the colonies until they became an aggregation. The problems of the colonial aggregation were those of food, protection, and procreation. In various ways, a colonial aggregation of cells became a standardized unity, and any advanced colonial aggregation came into possession by necessity, mutation, and natural selection of a central control system. The purpose of the colonial aggregation was to survive. To do this, it had to have food, means of defense, protection, and means of procreation. The control center which had developed had as its primary command, survive. Its prime purpose was the food, defense, protection, and means of procreation. Thus can be stated the second workable axiom. The purpose of the mind is to solve problems relating to survival. The ultimate success of the organism, its species or life, would be at its unimaginable extreme, immortality. The final failure, in obedience to the law survive, would be death. Between eternal survival and death lie innumerable gradations. In the middle ground of such a scale would be mere existence, without hope of much success and without fear of failure. Below this point would lie step by step innumerable small errors, accidents, losses, each one of which would tend to abbreviate the chances of reaching the ultimate goal. Above this point would lie the small successes, appreciations, and triumphs which would tend to secure the desirable goal. As an axiom, the mind can then be said to act in obedience to a central basic command, survive, to direct or manage the organism in its efforts to accomplish the ultimate goal for the individual or species or life, and to avoid for the individual or species or life any part of the final failure, which leads to the stated axiom, the mind directs the organism, the species, its symbiotes, or life, in the effort of survival. The Dianetic meaning of symbiote is extended beyond the dictionary definition, the living together of two dissimilar organisms, to mean any or all life or energy forms which are mutually dependent for survival. The atom depends on the universe on the atom. A study of the field of evolution will indicate that survival has been, will be, and is the sole test of an organism, whether the organism is treated in the form of daily activity or the life of the species. No action of the organism will be found to lie without the field of survival, for the organism is acting within its environment, upon information received or retained, and error or failure does not alter the fact that its basic impulse was motivated by survival. Another axiom may then be formulated as follows. The mind, as the central direction system of the body, poses, perceives, and resolves problems of survival, and directs or fails to direct their execution. As there are many organisms in the same species all attempting to accomplish the same end, and as there are many species, and as matter itself is attempting in one unit form or another to survive, there is necessarily conflict and contest among the individuals of the species, other species, or units of matter. Species cannot survive without being interested primarily in the species. Natural selection and other causes have established this as a primary rule for survival. that the unit remain alive as long as possible as a unit, and by association and procreation, that the species remain alive as a species. Second-grade interest is paid by the unit or the species to its symbiotes. Third-grade interest is paid to inanimate matter. As this is apparently the most workable solution, natural selection best preserves those species which follow this working rule, and the symbiotes of the successful species, therefore, have enhanced opportunity for survival. Man is the most successful organism currently in existence, at least on this planet. Man is currently winning in the perpetual cosmic election, which possibly may select the thinker of the new thought. Man is heir to the experience and construction of his own ancestors. As cellular conservatism is one of the factors of survival, his mind is basically the same mind which directed and resolved the problems of his animal forebears. By evolution and natural selection, this mind, therefore, has the primary priority in emergencies. Superimposed on this animal mind has been developed an enormously complex analyzer, which probably exists as his frontal lobe. The command survive is variable in individuals and species to the extent that it may be strong or weak. Superior strength of the command in the individual or species is normally but variably a survival factor. The primary facet of personality is the basic strength of the dynamic drive. Dynamic, the dynamic thrust into time and space of an individual, a species, or a unit of matter or energy, especially defined for the purpose of Dianetics as survive. The dynamic is variable from individual to individual and race to race. It is varied by physiology, environment, and experience. Its manifestation in the animal mind affects both the tenacity of the individual to life or purpose, and it affects the activity of the analyzer. The first characteristic of the individual which should be considered is the basic strength of his dynamic, by which an axiom can be formulated. The persistency of the individual in life is directly governed by the strength of his basic dynamic. The analytical, human, or as it has elsewhere been called erroneously, the conscious mind, is variable from individual to individual and race to race in its ability to perceive and resolve problems. Another axiom can then be formulated. Intelligence is the ability of an individual, group, or race to resolve problems relating to survival. It should be noted that there is a distinct difference between the dynamic and the intelligence. High intelligence may not denote high dynamic. High dynamic may not denote high intelligence. Intelligence is mental sensitivity and analytical ability. Dynamic is the persistency of the individual in obedience to the command, survive. It has been noted that there is a gradation in the scale of survival. Gains toward the ultimate goal are pleasurable. Failures toward the final defeat are sorrowful or painful. Pleasure is therefore the perception of well-being or an advance toward the ultimate goal. Pain, therefore, is the perception of a reduction toward the final defeat. Both are necessary survival factors. For the purpose of Dianetics, good and evil must be defined. Those things which may be classified as good by an individual are only those things which aid himself, his family, his group, his race, mankind, or life in its dynamic obedience to the command, modified by the observations of the individual, his family, his group, his race, or life. As evil may be classified those things which tend to limit the dynamic thrust of the individual, his family, his group, his race, or life in general in the dynamic drive, also limited by the observation, the observer, and his ability to observe. Good may be defined as constructive. Evil may be defined as destructive. Definitions modified by viewpoint. The individual man is an organism attempting to survive in affinity or contest with other men, races, and the three kingdoms. His goal is survival for himself, his progeny, his group, his race, his symbiotes, life, and the universe in general, in contest with any efforts or entities which threaten or impede his efforts to attain the goal. His happiness depends upon making, consolidating, or contemplating gains toward his goal. It is a purpose of Dianetics in general, and abnormal Dianetics in particular, to pass man across the abyss of irrational, solely reactive thought, and enter him upon a new stage of constructive progression to the ultimate goal. Chapter 2. An Analogy of the Mind. It is not the purpose of abnormal Dianetics to investigate or accurately reconstruct the human mind. The purpose of abnormal Dianetics is to delete from the existing mind those physically painful experiences which have resulted in the aberration of the analytical mind, to erase from the body psychosomatic illnesses, which are physical abnormalities and the physical manifestation of the aberration, and to restore in its entirety the proper working function of a mind not otherwise physically deranged. Abnormal Dianetics embraces the various physiological aspects of psychosomatic medicine, including the glandular balance or imbalance of the organism, as influenced by painful physical experiences. The measurement and increase of the dynamic is the practice and study of dynamic Dianetics, which subject is not included in this manual. The initial adjustments of the individual are included in child Dianetics and educational Dianetics. Surgical and medical procedures, as they affect the mind, are covered in medical Dianetics, which is briefly touched upon in this manual. Judicial Dianetics, political Dianetics, and military Dianetics are elsewhere touched upon or allocated for study. Dianetics as a family of sciences proceeds, however, from the axioms cursorily touched upon in the last chapter, and is uniformly governed by the principles of the behavior of the human mind, as enhanced by the techniques of abnormal Dianetics. All human activity proceeds primarily from the impulses covered in the primary science, dynamic Dianetics, which deals, as above, with the basic dynamic, its measurement and enhancement. The existence and variability of this dynamic are not primarily a subject for abnormal Dianetics, but must be considered as the only primary thrust in obedience to which the mind and body react. When the individual is acting contrary to the survival of himself, his group, progeny, race, mankind, or life, he can be considered to be unintelligent, uninformed, or aberrated. Every single instance of aberrated conduct threatening the general goal of the individual, as outlined in the last chapter, can be proven to have a source which will specifically be found to be a painful experience containing data not available to the analytical mind. Every single instance and facet of aberrated conduct has its exact causation in the physically painful error which has been introduced during a moment of absence of the analytical power. Abnormal Dianetics consists of discovering the aberration in the individual, finding the physically painful experience which corresponds to it, and deleting the perceptic content of that experience from the body and mind. More as an effort to demonstrate how that is accomplished than as an actual outline of the character of the mind, the following analogy is offered. First, there is the physio-animal section of the mind. This contains the motor controls, the subbrains, and the physical nervous system in general, including the physical aspect of the analytical section of the mind. The control of all voluntary and involuntary muscles is contained in this section. It commands all body fluids, blood flow, respiration, glandular secretion, cellular construction, and the activity of various parts of the body. Experimentation has adequately demonstrated this. The physio-animal mind has specific methods of thinking. These are entirely reactive. Animal experimentation, rats, dogs, etc., is experimentation on and with precisely this mind, and little more. It is a fully conscious mind, and should never be nominated by any term which denies it consciousness, since there is no period in the life of the organism, from conception to death, when this mind is not awake, observing and recording perceptions. This is the mind of a dog, cat, or rat, and is also the basic mind of a man, so far as its operating characteristics are concerned. A man in the deepest possible somnambulistic sleep is still in possession of more mind and thinking and coordinating ability than a lower animal. The term consciousness is no more than a designation of the awareness of now. The physio-animal mind never ceases to be aware of now, and never ceases to record the successive instances of now, which in their composite make up a time track which connects memory in an orderly chain. Cessation of life alone discontinues the continual recording of perceptions on this orderly track. Unconsciousness is a condition wherein the organism is discoordinated only in its analytical process and motor control direction. In the physio-animal section of the mind, a complete time track and a complete memory record of all perceptions for all moments of the organism's existence is available. As life progresses, for instance, from a blade of grass to a dog, greater and greater complexities and degrees of self-determinism are possible. Energy, in its various forms, is the primary motivator in the lower orders. But as the complexity of the order is increased into the animal kingdom, the physio-animal mind attains more and more command of the entire organism, until it itself begins to possess the second section of the mind. All animals possess in some slight degree an analyzer. This which we designate the analytical mind is present even in lower orders, since it is only that section of the mind which possesses the self-deterministic coordinative command of the physio-animal mind, and thus of the body. In a rat, for instance, it is no more than its conscious awareness of now, applying to lessons of then, without rationality, but with instinct and painful experience. This is the analytical section of the mind in a lower animal. But it is the reactive mind in a man, whose analytical mind is so highly attuned and intricate that it can command entirely both the physio-animal mind and thus the body. Man not only possesses a superior physio-animal mind, but possesses as well an analytical mind of such power and complexity that it possesses no real rival in any other species. The analytical mind of man cannot be studied by observing the reactions of animals under any situations. Not only is it more sensitive, but it possesses factors and sensitivities not elsewhere found. Continuing this analogy, lying between the analytical mind and the physio-animal mind, may be conceived the reactive mind. This is the coordinated responses of the physio-animal mind, the analytical mind of animals, and the first post of emergency command in man. All errors of a psychic or psychosomatic nature can be considered, for the purposes of this analogy, to lie in the reactive mind. The first human analytical mind took command of the body and physio-animal mind under strained and dangerous circumstances, when man was still in violent contest with other species around him. It can be considered that the analytical mind received command with the single proviso that instantaneous emergency would be handled by the outdated but faster reactive mind. Any and all errors in thinking and action derive from the reactive mind, as it is increased in strength and power by painful experience. It can be called a shadow mind, instantaneously reactive when any of its content is perceived in the environment of the individual, at which time it urgently bypasses the analytical mind and causes immediate reaction in the physio-animal mind and in the body. Additionally, the reactive mind is in continual presence when chronically restimulated by a constantly present restimulator, which is to say, an approximation of the reactive mind's content, or some part thereof, continually perceived in the environment of the organism. The reactive mind is in action so long as it is activated by an exact or nearly exact approximation of its content. But given too continuous a restimulation, it can and does derange both the physio-animal mind and body below it, and the analytical mind above it. It was created by deranging circumstances of a physical nature, hence it deranges. The entire content of the reactive mind is records of physical pain with its accompanying perceptions during disconnection of the analyzer. All aberrated conduct and error on the part of an individual is occasioned by restimulation of his reactive mind. None of these minds are unconscious, nor are they subconscious. The entire organism is always conscious. But the temporary dispersion of the thought processes of the analytical mind brings about a condition whereby that mind, having been dispersed and considering itself the residence of person, is unable to obtain and reach data perceived and received by the organism during the analytical mind's condition of dispersion. That the analytical mind can be thrown by pain or shock out of circuit is a survival factor of its own. As sensitive machinery, it must be protected by a fuse system. Chapter 3. The Dynamics. The basic dynamic, survive, increases in complexity as the complexity of the organism evolves. Energy may be considered to have taken many paths through eternity to arrive intact at the infinite goal. The why of the goal may lie above the finite line, but below it, demarked by the word survive, definite manifestations are visible. Energy collects into various forms of matter, which collect and aggregate in various materials and compounds. Life evolves from the simplest basic into complex forms, since evolutionary change is in itself a method of survival. Conflict among species and individuals within the species is additionally a survival factor. Affinity of individuals for groups, races, and the whole of its species, and for other species, is additionally a survival factor, as strong or stronger than conflict. Dynamic is defined as the dynamic thrust through time toward the attainment of the goal. Survive is considered to be the lowest common denominator of all energy efforts and all forms. It can then be subdivided specifically into several dynamic lines as applicable to each form or species. The unaberrated self contains 4 main dynamics, which are held in common with man. The 4 dynamics are not new forces. They are subdivisions of the basic dynamic. The dynamics are 1. Personal, 2. Sex, 3. Group, and 4. Mankind. An entire philosophy can be built around each one of these dynamics, which will account for all the actions of an individual. Any one of these philosophies is so complete that it can be logically made to include the other 4. In other words, all purpose of an individual can be rationalized into the personal dynamic. A philosophy exists which attempts to rationalize everything into the sexual dynamic, and so on with all the dynamics. Observing that each one can stand as a logical unity, one finds it necessary to retire to the lowest common denominator of the basic dynamic, which actually does explain the 4 subdivisions. As each one of the subdivisions is capable of supporting the whole weight of a rational argument, it can readily be deduced that each is of nearly equal importance in the individual. The aberrated conditions of a society tend to vary the stress on these dynamics, making first one and then another the keynote of the society. In an unaberrated individual or society, the validity of all 4 would be recognized. The unaberrated individual may physiologically possess or environmentally stress one or more of these dynamics above the others. In terms of basic personality, as covered in the field of dynamic Dianetics, the physiological, environmental, educational aspect of the individual is varied in strength in the 4 dynamics. Each one of the 4 dynamics breaks further into purposes which are specific and complex. Purposes and other factors entangle these dynamics in varying situations, and the observational power of the individual may conflict one against another of these dynamics within the individual himself. This is a basic complex factor of the unaberrated personality. 1. The personal dynamic consists of the dynamic thrust to survive as an individual, to obtain pleasure as an individual, and to avoid pain. It covers the general field of food, clothing, and shelter, personal ambition, and general individual purpose. 2. The sexual dynamic embraces the procreation of progeny, the care of that progeny, and the securing for that progeny of better survival conditions and abilities in the future. 3. The group dynamic embraces the various units of the species man, such as the association, the military company, the people in the surrounding countryside, the nation, and the race. It is characterized by activity on the part of the individual to obtain and maintain the survival of the group of which he is a part. 4. The mankind dynamic embraces the survival of the species. While man is concerned with any one of the above dynamics, any one of them may become antipathetic to his own survival. This is rational conflict, and is normally and commonly incident to survival. It is non-aberrative in that it is rational within the educative limitation. The family as a unit is not a dynamic, but a combination of dynamics. And in this and other societies, it attains a position of interest which is not necessarily inherent in the individual or group. Basically simple, complexity is introduced among the dynamics by individual and group irrationalities. The basic, unaberrated individual has continual difficulty rationalizing the problems of importances and choices among these dynamics. When the basic individual becomes aberrated and is attendantly unable to reason freely on all problems, a selection of importances among these dynamics becomes nearly impossible, and produces aberrated solutions which may resolve such an extreme as the destruction of the individual himself by himself, under the mistaken solution that he may thus obey the primary command. Note, all self-destructive effort is irrationality of a precise nature, which will often be found by the auditor in a person under treatment, but which forms no part of the basic personality of the individual. The term auditor is used in Dianetics to designate someone skilled in the practice of Dianetic therapy, called auditing. The conduct of an auditor is covered later. Chapter 4. The Basic Individual. For the purposes of this work, the terms basic individual and clear are nearly synonymous, since they denote the unaberrated self in complete integration and in a state of highest possible rationality. A clear is one who has become the basic individual through therapy. The precise personality of the basic individual is of interest to the auditor. His complete characteristic is established by 1. The strength of his basic dynamic, 2. The relative strengths of his dynamics, 3. The sensitivity, which is to say, the intelligence of his analyzer, 4. The coordination of his motor controls, 5. His physiological and glandular condition, 6. His environment and education. The experiences of each individual also create an individual composite, and so may additionally designate individuality. There are as many distinct individuals on earth as there are men, women, and children. That we can establish a common denominator of dynamic and basic function does not, cannot, and will not alter the fact that individuals are amazingly varied, one from the next. It will be found by experience and exhaustive research, as it has been clinically established, that the basic individual is invariably responsive in all the dynamics and is essentially good. There are varying degrees of courage, but in the basic individual there is no pusillanimity. The virtues of the basic individual are innumerable. His intentional vices and destructive dramatizations are non-existent. He is cooperative, constructive, and possessed of purpose. In short, he is in close alignment with that ideal which mankind recognizes as an ideal. This is a necessary part of an auditor's working knowledge, since deviations from it denote the existence of aberration, and such departures are unnatural and enforced, and are no part of the self-determinism of the individual. Man is not a reactive animal. He is capable of self-determinism. He has willpower. He ordinarily has high analytical ability. He is rational and he is happy and integrated only when he is his own basic personality. The most desirable state in an individual is complete self-determinism. Such self-determinism may be altered and shaped to some degree by education and environment, but so long as the individual is not aberrated, he is in possession of self-determinism. So long as he is self-determined in his actions, he adjusts himself successfully to the degree that his environment will permit such an adjustment. He will be more forceful, effective, and happier in that environment than when aberrated. That the basic personality is good does not mean that he cannot be a terribly effective enemy of those things rationally recognizable as destructive to himself and to his. The basic individual is not a buried, unknown, or different person, but an intensity of all that is best and most able in the person. The basic individual equals the same person minus his pain and dramatizations. The dynamic strength of the person does not derive from his aberrations. The aberrations lessen the dynamic strength. Artistry, personal force, personality, all are residual in the basic personality. This is derived from clinical research and experimentation. The only reason an aberrated individual, occasionally holds hard to his aberrations is because his engrams have a content which forbids their removal. Chapter 5. Engrams. The reactive mind consists of a collection of experiences received during an unanalytical moment, which contains pain and actual or conceived antagonism to the survival of the individual. An engram is a perceptic entity which can be precisely defined. The aggregate of engrams compose the reactive mind. A new subfield entitled perceptics has been originated here to adequately define engrammic data. Perceptics contains, as one of its facets, the field of semantics. Precisely as the field of semantics is organized, so is organized in perceptics each sensory perception. The audiosyllabic communication system of man has its counterpart in various languages observable in lower animals. Words are sounds in syllabic form, delivered with a definite timbre, pitch, and volume, or sight recognition in each case. Words are a highly specialized form of audioperceptics. The quality of the sound uttering the word is nearly as important as the word itself. The written word belongs in part to visioperceptics. Having but lately acquired his extensive vocabulary, the mind of man is least adjusted to words and their sense. The mind is better able to differentiate among qualities of utterance than among the meanings of words themselves. Included in perceptics, in the same fashion and on the same axioms as semantics, are the other sensory perceptions: organic sensation, the tactile sense, the olfactory sense, and the senses involved with sight and hearing. Each has its own grouping, and each carries its class of messages with highly complex meanings. Each one of these divisions of the senses is plotted in time, according to the earliest or most forceful significances. Each class of messages is so filed as to lead the individual toward pleasure and away from pain. The classifications and study of this varied sensory file have been designated perceptics. When injury or illness supplants the analytical mind, producing what is commonly known as unconsciousness, and when physical pain and antagonism to the survival of the organism are present, an engram is received by the individual. Subsequently, during moments when the potential of the analytical mind is reduced by weariness, illness, or similar circumstances, one or more of the perceptics contained in the engram may be observed by the individual in his environment, and without his perceiving that he has observed it, or the identity of it, the individual discovers himself in a dramatization of the moment of receipt of the engram. An engram impedes one or more dynamics of the basic individual. Being antagonistic to his survival, it can be considered analogically to consist of a reverse charge. As an example, the analytical mind can be said to possess multiple scanners in layers. Ordinary or pleasurable memory can be considered to have, as an analogy only, a positive charge. The multiple scanners are able to sweep these areas and make available memory data to the analytical mind so that it can arrive by various mathematical means at a solution for its various problems. The engram, as a specific memory package, can be considered to have a reverse charge, which cannot be reached by the scanners of the analytical mind, but which is directly connected to the motor controls and other physical functions, and which can exert, at a depth not nearly as basic as the basic dynamic, but nevertheless low, a hidden influence upon the analytical mind through another circuit. The analytical mind in awareness of now, nevertheless, is unable to discover, without therapeutic assistance, the existence of such an engram, since it was received during a moment of extremely low potential on the part of the analytical mind. As a further analogy, and for demonstration only, an engram can be considered to be a bundle of perceptions of a precise nature. An engram is an entire dramatic sequence implanted during unconsciousness, which possesses specific perceptic keys. any one of which, when unanalytically perceived by the individual in his environment, may in greater or lesser degrees set the engram into reaction. Denied to the analytical mind at its reception, it is denied to the analytical mind in its exact character during its dramatization. Its content is literal, and on the physio-animal level demands action. Man's analytical ability and his vocabulary are imposed above both the physio-animal mind and the reactive mind, both on the evolutionary time track and in awareness. The charge contained in the engram is inexhaustible and remains reactive in full force whenever keyed into the circuit by restimulators. Restimulators are those approximations in the environment of an individual of the content of an engram. Restimulators can exist in any of the various senses. The orderly filing of perceptics in the memory does not apparently include the content of engrams, these being filed separately under an immediate danger heading. There are three kinds of thought. The first is engrammic, or literal. It demands immediate action without examination by the analytical mind. A hand being withdrawn from a hot stove when burned is being governed by the reactive principle. But as the ensuing instant of unconsciousness caused by the shock is ordinarily slight, no real engram can be said to have formed. The second type of thought is justified thought. Engrammic thought is literal, without reason, irrational. Justified thought is the attempt of the analytical mind to explain the reactive engrammic reactions of the organism, or the mind, in the ordinary course of living. Every engram may cause some form of aberrated conduct on the part of the individual. Justified thought is the effort of the conscious mind to explain away that aberration, without admitting, as it cannot do normally, that it has failed the organism. The third and optimum type of thought is rational thought. This is the thought used by a clear. An engram is an apparent surcharge in the mental circuit with certain definite, finite content. That charge is not reached or examined by the analytical mind, but that charge is capable of acting as an independent command. When the basic dynamic of the individual is boosted in potential by an observed necessity, the residual charge in engrams is insufficient to contest, at times, the raised purpose. The analytical mind can then be seen to function in entire command of the organism, without serious modification by engrammic command. At other times, hostility in the environment and confusion of the analytical mind combine to reduce the dynamic potential to such a degree that the engrammic command, in comparison to the basic dynamic, can be seen to be extremely powerful. It is at such times, in the presence of even faint restimulators, that the individual most demonstrates his aberrations. An engram is severely painful or severely threatening to the survival of the organism, and is an engram only if it cannot be reached by the awake analytical mind. A simple approximation of the action of an engram can be accomplished by an experiment in hypnotism, whereby a positive suggestion is delivered to an amnesia-tranced patient, which contains a post-hypnotic signal. The subject, having been commanded to forget the suggestion when awake, will then perform the act. This suggestion is then actually a light portion of the reactive mind. It is literally interpreted, unquestioningly followed, since it is received during a period of unawareness by the analytical mind or some portion of it. The restimulator, which may be the act of the operator adjusting his tie, causes the subject to commit some act. The subject will then explain why he is doing what he is doing, no matter how illogical that action may be. The post-hypnotic suggestion is then recalled to the subject's mind, and he remembers it. The compulsion vanishes, unless it is laid upon an actual engram. The obedience of the subject to the command has, as its source, engrammic thought. The explanation by the subject for his own action is the analytical mind observing the organism, which it supposes to have in its sole charge, and justifying itself. The release of the post-hypnotic suggestion into the analytical mind brings about rational thought. Engrams can be considered to be painfully inflicted, often timeless, post-hypnotic suggestions delivered antagonistically to the unconscious subject. The post-hypnotic suggestion given the subject in the above example would not have any permanent effect on the subject. even if it were not removed by the operator, because there was presumed to be no antagonism involved, unless, of course, it rested on a former engram. For every engram, there is a somatic as part of that engram. No aberration exists without its somatics, unless it is a racial educational aberration, in which instance it is compatible with its environment, and so is not considered irrational. Every aberration contains its exact command in some engram. The number of engrams per individual are relatively few. The aberrated condition of the individual does not depend on the number of engrams, but the severity of individual engrams. An engram is severe in the exact ratio that it is conceived by the organism to have been a moment of threat to survival. The character of the threat and the perceptic content produces the aberration. A number of engrams with similar perceptics, engram chain, in an individual produce a complex aberration pattern, which nevertheless has for its parts individual engrams. Example: engram received at the age of 3½ years. Adult subject. As child in dental chair against his will, under antagonistic conditions, given nitrous oxide and tricked by dentist. During painful portion of treatment, the dentist says, "He is asleep. He can't hear, feel, or see anything. Stay there." The perceptics which can be restimulated in this are the quality, pitch, and volume of the dentist's voice, the sound of the dentist's drill, the slap of the cable running the drill, street noises of a specific kind, the tactile of the mouth being forcibly held open, the smell of the mask, the sound of running water, the smell of nitrous oxide, and, in short, several of each perceptic class, excluding only sight. The effect of this experience, being a part of an engram chain which contained two earlier experiences, precursors, was in some small degree to trance the individual and maintain some portion of him in a regressed state. This engram is too brief and extraordinarily simple, but it will serve as an example to the auditor. The timeless quality of the suggestions, the conceived antagonism, precursors on the engram chain, awakened and reinforced. All these things confused the time sense with the individual, and were otherwise reactive in later life. An aberration is the manifestation of an engram, and is serious only when it influences the competence of the individual in his environment. Engrams are of two types, depending upon the duration of restimulation. There are floaters and chronics. A floater has not been restimulated during the lifetime succeeding it in the individual. A chronic is an engram which has been more or less continuously restimulated, so that it has become an apparent portion of the individual. A chronic begins to gather locks. A floater has not accumulated locks, since it has never been restimulated. A lock is a painful mental experience. It is or is not regarded by the analytical mind as a source of difficulty or aberration. It is a period of mental anguish, and is wholly dependent upon an engram for its pain value. A lock can be conceived to be joined to an engram in such a way that it can be reached by the multiple scanners of the analytical mind which cannot reach the engram. When an engram is activated into a chronic, it accumulates numerous locks along the time track of the individual. The engram itself is not immediately locatable except somatically along the time track of the individual. Locks are of some diagnostic value, but as they exist as experiences, more or less recallable by the analytical mind, they can be depended upon to vanish upon the removal of the engram from the reactive mind without further therapy. The treating of a lock as a lock has some therapeutic value, but the exhaustion of locks from an aberrated individual is long and arduous, and is seldom productive of any lasting result. Upon the location and exhaustion of the engram from the reactive mind, all of its locks vanish. An engram may exist unactivated as a floater for any number of years, or for the entire duration of an individual's life. At any future moment after the receipt of an engram, whether that time period consists of days or decades, the floater may reactivate into a lock, at which time it becomes part of the commands obeyed by the analytical mind in its efforts to rationalize. The removal of the individual from his restimulators, which is to say the environment in which the engram was reactive, is in itself a form of therapy, since the engram may then return to its status as a floater. But such a return will not remove the locks which the analytical mind can then recall as painful experiences. Example: engram. At birth occurs the phrase, "no good," uttered during a moment of headache and gasping on the part of a child. Lock. At the age of 7, the mother, in a fit of rage while the child was ill with a minor malady, said that he was no good. The removal of the engram also removes, ordinarily without further attention, the lock. Note: birth remained inactive in the above case as a floater until the moment of reduced analytical power at the age of 7, when a birth phrase was repeated. It is worth remarking that the entire content of the birth engram is given simultaneously both to the child and to the mother, with only the difference of somatics. It is further worthy of note that the mother quite often perceives in the child a restimulator, and uses against it the phrases which were said when the child gave the mother the greatest pain, namely, birth. The child is then victimized into various psychosomatic ills by the repetition of its birth engram restimulators, which ills may develop even more seriously into actual disease. The mind controls the multiple and complex functions of the growth and condition of the organism. Containing organic sensation as one of its perceptics, the engram then, when reactivated, causes a somatic, and additionally may deny body fluids, i.e. hormones and blood, to some portion of the anatomy, occasioning psychosomatic ills. The denial of fluid or adequate blood supply may result in a potentially infective area. The psychosomatic reduces the resistance of some portion of the body to actual disease. Somatic and other sensory errors find their basis in unconscious antagonistic moments. A somatic may be adjusted by an address to a lock, but the permanency of adjustment obtains only until such time as the engram is again reactivated, causing another lock. All aberrations are occasioned by engrams. The physio-animal mind of an organism never ceases recording in some level. The exact moment when recording begins in an organism has not at this date been accurately determined. It has been found to be very early, probably earlier than 4 months after conception and 5 months before birth. In the presence of pain, any moment prior to the age of 2 years may be considered to be unanalytical. Any painful experience received by the fetus contains its full perceptic package, including darkness. Once an auditor has worked a prenatal engram and has seen its influence upon the engram chain and the awake life of the adult, no question will remain in his mind concerning the actuality of the experience. That the fetus does record is attributable to a phenomenon of the extension of perceptions during moments of pain and the absence of the analytical mind. Laboratory experiment demonstrates that under hypnosis, an individual's sensory perception may be artificially extended. The existence of pain in any large degree is sufficient to extend the hearing of the fetus, so that it records during the existence of pain and the presence of exterior sound the entire and complete record of the experience. As a chronic engram is but precariously fixed on the mind, the syllables or voice timbres contained in the prenatal will reactivate the somatic and the emotional engramic content whenever the approximations of that engram appear in the child's or the adult's vicinity. The understanding of language is not necessary to reactivate an engram, since the recording of the mind is so precise that the utterance of the identical words in similar tones during later prenatal periods, or during birth, or immediately after birth, can and may occasion the original prenatal or any of the prenatals to become reactive, producing locks, injuring the health of the infant, or for that matter, of the fetus. The perceptics of the fetus are extended only during moments of pain, but a chain of prenatal engrams can occasion a condition wherein the hearing of the fetus is chronically extended, forming numerous locks before birth. These locks will vanish when the actual engrams are discovered and exhausted from the psyche. Any painful unanalytical moment containing antagonism is not only a matter of record, but a source of potential action in the human organism at any period during its lifetime. reserving, of course, the question of when the fetus first begins to record. Birth is ordinarily a severely painful unconscious experience. It is ordinarily an engram of some magnitude. Anyone who has been born then possesses at least one engram. Any period of absence of analytical power during receipt of physical pain has some engramic value. Moments when the analytical power is present in some quantity, when physical pain is absent and only antagonism to the organism is present, do not form engrams and are not responsible for the aberration of the individual. Sociological maladjustments, parental punishments of a minor sort, even when they include pain, libidos, childhood struggles, and jealousies, are not capable of aberrating the individual. These can influence the personality and environment adjustment of the individual, but so long as he is not pathologically incompetent, he can and will resolve these problems and remain without aberration. The human mind is an enormously powerful organism, and its analytical ability is great. It is not overlaid above naturally unsocial or evil desires, but is founded upon powerful and constructive basics, which only powerful, painful, and antagonistic experiences can impede. Engrams will be found to have been conceived by the individual as intensely antagonistic to the survival of the organism. The discovery of the basic engram is the first problem of the auditor. It normally results in an engram chain. The content of that chain will be found to be physically severe. An engram is physically painful, is conceived by the organism as an antagonistic threat to its survival, and is received during the absence of the analytical power of the mind. These factors may vary within the engram so that an engram may be of minimal pain, maximal antagonism, and minimal absence of the analytical power, but no engram is available to the scanners of the consciousness. Attention! One has as much functioning analyzer as one has awareness of now. The body is to some degree re-undergoing the experience of the engram whenever the experience is restimulated. A chronic psychosomatic, such as a painful arm, indicates the chronic continuous coexistence with now of the moment the arm is broken or hurt. Several engrams reactivated into a chronic state bring several moments of unconsciousness, pain, and antagonism into a coexistence with now. The engram is a bundle of perceptics, which include as the primary manifestation organic sensation. The organic sensation is enforced on the members of the body to a greater or lesser degree, whenever and as long as the engram is restimulated. There is only one psychosomatic, which is common to all engrams. Any engram contains this as part of the command it will enforce upon the body. The analytical mind is an organism and a part of the human body. As a stomach may be made to ache chronically, ulcers, to feel broken, the engram also enforces a command upon the organ of the analytical mind. That command is common to every engram. Engrams are valid only when they are received during a momentary dispersal of shocked null condition of the analytical mind. Every engram contains and enforces the command on the analytical mind that it has been dispersed and is not operating. This is common to every engram. This is reduction of the intellect by engrams, totally aside from specific engramic content. It explains at once insanity and the remarkable mental facility of a clear. Chapter 6. Aberrations. All aberrations of any kind are of precisely the same nature as covered in the last chapter. It is the content of the engram which causes the aberration and forms its nature. Complexity among engramic contents may demonstrate a most complex aberration. The various commands contained in the engrams, reactivating and modifying the basic dynamic command of the mind, produce abnormal characteristics in the behavior of the analytical mind, which are chronic or sporadic, as the engrams occasioning them are restimulated. An entire concept of existence may be built from engramic content. Conflicts in the commands contained in engrams and conflicts between the basic dynamic and the engramic content combine into behavior patterns. When the organism has become so aberrated that it can no longer adapt itself to this environment. It can be considered to be insane in that environment. Change of environment may relieve the condition, or more certainly, the exhaustion of the content of the reactive mind will restore the ability of the analytical mind to solve the problems with which it is confronted. Whatever the engrammic content of the reactive mind and its potential influence upon the behavior of the individual, it does not necessarily follow that the reactive mind may be chronically restimulated. However, when the reactive mind has been restimulated consistently, the analytical mind called upon to solve the problems around and through antagonistic and incorrect data may be unable to perform its task. In the absence of disease or injury, any mind not in a physiological amentia state may be restored to normal function by the removal of the reactive mind. It should be noted, however, that this is modified by the fact that individuals who have received insulin shocks, prefrontal lobotomies, electric shocks, and other shock treatments are regarded as equivocal and are temporarily classed with disease cases for lack of adequate observation in this stage of the experimental research. People can be regarded as rational or irrational only insofar as they react in their customary environment. But any individual in possession of a reactive mind is an unknown quantity until that reactive mind has been examined. If he has been examined, his mind can be cleared in the same process. There are several factors which may be contained in the engrams in the reactive mind, which most certainly tend toward aberration. These include engrammic commands, which derange the time sense of the individual, and thus apparently destroy his time track. Engrams which contain restimulators of such timelessness and such perceptic content that they remain thereafter continually with the individual and seem to arrest him or regress him in time. Engrams which contain commands that make the individual chronically unable to conceive differences are especially harmful, since these tend to compare everything to engrammic value, and thus cause the individual to arrive at a chronic state of engrammic thinking. The mind is an organism which resolves problems related to survival, utilizing its ability to conceive similarities and observe differences. Engrams which destroy or tend to hold in suspension the analytical mind's ability to conceive associations most influence the apparent intelligence of the mind. But engrams which tend by their command content to destroy the mind's ability to conceive differences may produce severe aberration. Example: all men are alike, received as powerful engrammic content, would tend to compare every man and associate him with those men contained in the reactive mind as painful and dangerous. An aberration may attain any form or complexion. As a rough analogy, a compulsion may be conceived to be an engrammic command that the organism must do something. A repression is a command that the organism must not do something. A neurosis is an emotional state containing conflicts and emotional data, inhibiting the abilities or welfare of the individual. And a psychosis is a conflict of commands which seriously reduce the individual's ability to solve his problems in his environment, to a point where he cannot adjust himself to some vital phase of his environmental needs. All this variety of manifestation of aberration is occasioned by the pain-enforced commands or contents of engrams. Physical aberrations are occasioned by engrams when they are not the result of injury or disease. Even then, the aspect may be improved by the exhaustion of the reactive mind of the sick individual. The engram cannot manifest itself as a mental aberration without also manifesting itself, to some degree, as somatic aberration. Removal of the somatic content of engrams, which is also necessary to obtain any other relief, can and does occasion glandular readjustment, cellular growth, cellular inhibition, and other physiological corrections. Chapter 7. The Tone Scale. The tone scale denotes numerically, first, the status of an engram in the reactive mind, next, its progress during work, and provides a measure of sanity in an individual. The derivation of this scale is clinical and is based upon observation of engrams during work. When an engram is located and developed, the extreme range it can follow begins with apathy, develops into anger, or the various facets of antagonism, proceeds into boredom, and arrives at last in cheerfulness, or vanishes utterly. The tone scale is essentially an assignation of numerical value by which engrams and individuals can be numerically classified. It is not arbitrary, but will be found to approximate some actual governing law in nature. Tone 0 is equivalent to death. An engram with 0 tone would be a death engram. An individual with a 0 tone would be dead. Ranging upward from 0 to 1 is then that emotional bracket which may be denoted as apathy, along its graduated scale from death to the beginnings of apathetic resentment. From 1 to 2 is the range of antagonism, including suspicion, resentment, and anger. Boredom and its equivalents, by which is denoted minor annoyance, begins at 2 and ends at 3. From 3 to 4 are the emotions which range from carelessness to cheerfulness. The term tone 4 denotes an engram or an individual who has achieved complete rationality and cheerfulness. The decimal scale can be used from 0.0 to 4.0 to approximate the emotional value of engrams and their ability to impede the dynamics. Each engram residual in the reactive mind has its own independent tonal value. Serious engrams will be found in the apathy range. Dangerous engrams will be found in the anger range. Above 2.5, an engram could not be considered to have any great value in affecting the analytical mind. Each engram in the reactive mind, then, can be said to possess a tone value. The composite sum of these engrams will give, if added, a numerical value to the reactive mind. Engrams can be computed as they lie along the dynamics, and to each dynamic may be assigned a tone. The sum of the tones of the dynamics divided by the number of the dynamics will give a potential numerical value for an individual. This, of course, is variable, depending on the existence of restimulators in his environment to reactivate the engrams. The general tone of an individual is important both in diagnosis and in establishing a resolution to the case. The probable average of mankind at this writing may be in the vicinity of 3.0. Complete rationality depends upon exhaustion of the reactive mind, and complete rationality is invariably the result of reaching tone 4. The initial diagnosis for a person in Dianetics is done by the assignation of a general tone to denote the condition of his reactive mind. His methods of meeting life, his emotional reaction to the problems in his environment, can be evaluated by the use of the tone scale. In therapy, as will be covered later, an engram normally can be expected to run from its initial value in the apathy or anger range to tone 4. Very shortly after it reaches tone 4, it should vanish. If it vanishes without attaining the laughter of tone 4, it can be assumed that the individual's basic engram has not been erased. The tone scale has value in the therapy and should be thoroughly understood. Chapter 8. The Character of Engrams. There are several general types of engrams. It must be understood that the mind possesses a time track of one sort or another, and that this track is a specific thing. The time track of an individual will include all those things available to his analytical mind, but the data which he can easily contact along his time track is definitely not engramic, even if it possesses an emotional charge. Everything on this track will be rational or justified experience. It will not include engrams. It may include locks or even engram locks, which is to say that it may include moments of mental anguish or antagonism, and may even include instances of unconsciousness which have some slight engramic value, and which are locks on some engram. An engram has several specific positive characteristics. It is received by the individual at some moment of physical pain. It is not available to the analyzer, and it includes conceived or actual antagonism to the survival of the organism. Certain mechanisms, such as forget it, may swerve a minimally painful or unconscious experience off the time track. In that case, it becomes possessed of engramic value. All engrams with power to derange the analytical mind and aberrate the physical body lie off the time track and are not available to the analytical mind without auditor assistance. By reason of its disorganization during the moment the engram was received, or because it has been forcibly instructed that the data in the engram is not to be recalled, the analyzer cannot reach the engram by ordinary means because the data has been erroneously labeled dangerous, important, or too painful to touch. The engram then, by a bypass circuit, feeds hidden commands into the analyzer. By a direct instantaneous circuit, it is permanently connected to the motor controls, all perceptic channels, the glands, and heart. It is awaiting a moment of low general tone, weariness, or injury when the analytical mind has reduced powers. It is also awaiting the perception of one or more of the engram's restimulators in the environment of the organism. Continuous restimulation of the engrams can in itself cause a low general tone, which in its turn permits more engrams to become restimulated. As the reactive mind comes into a more or less completely chronic state of reaction, the individual becomes more and more governed by this mind. His thought becomes more and more engramic, and he can be seen to drop in general tone on the tone scale down to the break point, which may be arbitrarily placed somewhere between 2.0 and 2.5, and below which lies the region of insanity. Engramic thought is irrational identity thought, by which the mind is made to conceive identities where only vague similarities may exist. It is necessary that the auditor thoroughly understand engramic thought, for it is with this complete irrationality of identity that he will basically deal. As he works with any individual, sane or insane, he must continually employ in the bulk of his computation on the case the equation of engramic thinking. Engramic thinking can be stated by A equals A equals A equals A equals A. The engram, when one or more of its restimulators is perceived in the environment during a moment of low general tone, may dramatize. The dramatization is the precise content of the engram. The aberration is the precise content of the engram. The reaction of an individual's analytical mind when an engram is reactivated is justification. There is reason to believe that part of this survival mechanism consists of the axiom: the analyzer must never permit an incorrect solution. The engram brings about many incorrect solutions. The analyzer may very well become entirely involved with the attempt to discover and deliver to a society or to itself adequate rational reasons for the behavior of the organism. The analytical mind, though working from the command of the engram itself, is unaware of the source of the command. Not being able to discover the source, it introverts more and more in an effort to solve a problem which contains danger to the organism. The analytical mind tends to find the danger without and within the organism. There are 5 ways that the organism can react to a danger in its vicinity. It can attack it, avoid it, neglect it, run from it, or succumb to it. In just these ways can the analytical mind, which it must be remembered is possessed of self-determinism and willpower, react to the reactive mind. As the general tone lowers, which is to say as the analytical mind becomes less and less powerful, through weariness, continual reverses in general health, etc., the more and more heed it must give to the problems unsolved in the reactive mind. These are in essence unsolved problems. As such, they contain their own solutions. The analytical mind, unable to reach them, justifies the organism's reaction to them, succumbs to them, causes the organism to attempt to flee from them, apathetically may neglect them, as in prefrontal lobotomy, avoids them in many intricate ways, or attacks them. The analytical mind is not only not certain where the experience lies on the time track, it also does not know whether the menace is within the organism or without it. So it can become entirely indiscriminate, and eventually it may achieve highly irrational solutions by which it seeks to solve the problems of the highly irrational reactive mind. The deep sensory perception channel entering the mind is evidently equipped with an appreciator, which sorts according to the momentary general tone or potential of the analytical mind. The higher the general tone or potential of the analytical mind, the better the data in the appreciator is sorted. The appreciator circuits are evidently fully apprised of engrammic content in the reactive mind, and evaluate restimulators perceived in the environment against the general tone of the analytical mind. When that is low, restimulators route more or less directly to the reactive mind, which instantly responds by fixed connections into the motor controls. Commands to the various members, muscles, glands, and organs of the body may be sporadic or constant, producing a high variety of responses in the body. Entire vocabularies are fed into the voice circuits, directly from the reactive mind when an engram is restimulated. Orders to be active or inactive are fed to other portions. The individual time track of the engram spaces the commands to the organism, and a dramatization is accomplished which may contain a portion or all of the content of the engram as governed by the situation. Psychosomatic ills, hysterias, rages, tantrums, criminal acts, and any and all content prejudicial to the survival of the organism in which the organism is seen to be indulging, has as its source the reactive mind. The sole and only content of the reactive mind is what exterior sources have done to the organism. None of the content of the reactive mind is self-motivated. The auditor is then interested only in what is done to the person, not what the person himself has done, since for purposes of therapy, the acts of the organism in its society can be discounted beyond diagnosis. Even then, they are of small importance to the auditor. An organism possessed of an analytical mind not victimized by incapacitating disease or injury, and unaberrated, will commit no act knowingly prejudicial to the survival of the organism or other factors within the dynamics. It will combat only those dangers in society which are actual menaces. Whatever may be the status of the innate moral sense, the basic intent of the basic personality is to further various energy forms along the dynamic toward the goal. Only moments of actual dispersal of the awareness of the analytical mind permit data to be received, which is prejudicial to the intent of the dynamics. Only from these unconscious moments can the basically stable and enormously powerful and able analytical mind be aberrated through the implantation of unanalyzed, painfully administered, and antagonistic information. It is the purpose of the auditor to find and exhaust these moments from the life of the individual. This therapy includes, therefore, as its basic principle, the exhaustion of all the painfully unconscious moments of a person's life. By eradicating pain from the life of an individual, the auditor returns the individual to complete rationality and sanity. The auditor should never be content with merely bringing the individual back to normal. He should achieve with the individual a tone 4, even though this is far in advance of the average state of society at this time. A tone 4 with his dynamics intact and powerful, with his rationality and intelligence increased to the optimum, becomes extremely valuable to the society, whatever his past. Knowing this, the auditor can expect a maximum result of lasting duration with any person not physically hopeless. An auditor in Dianetics will achieve the best results by ignoring impulses to educate or inform the individual in any way beyond instructions sufficient to acquire cooperation. The entire purpose of the auditor is to rehabilitate the basic dynamic, the 4 dynamics, and the normal purpose or profession of the individual. Anything implanted by positive suggestion or education in the course of therapy is harmful and must be canceled if delivered. Only the basic personality of the individual can decide and evaluate things in his environment. Therefore, hypnotism as practiced with positive suggestion is shunned, since any and all hypnotic commands with the attendant forgetter mechanisms are no more than artificially implanted engrams. Indeed, it is quite usual for the auditor to have to exhaust hypnotically implanted material, received either from some hypnotist or from the individual's analytical mind itself when he is operating under quote-unquote self-control. Hypnotism, as such, does not work, and a study and short practice in Dianetics will reveal exactly why. The auditor is attempting to delete the reactive mind from the individual. This reactive mind is an infestation of foreign, careless, and unreasoning commands, which disrupt the self-determinism of the individual to such an extent that he no longer has charge, through his analytical mind, of the organism itself, but finds himself under the continual and chronic orders of unseen, never-reviewed exterior forces, often and usually antipathetic to the survival of the organism. Engrams deal with identities where no identities exist. They therefore pose many strange and irrational problems, which are seen as aberrations in people. If a human being has been born and not cleared, he can be supposed to have at least one engram. Anyone who has a birth which has not been cleared by therapy has, therefore, a reactive mind. There is no disgrace attached to having a reactive mind, since it was thrust, without his consent and without his knowledge, upon an unconscious and helpless individual. Sometimes this was done by people with the best of imaginable intentions. A person not possessed of a rational mind cannot be rationally considered to be morally responsible, no matter the demands of the current society, which hitherto lacked any method of determining responsibility. The pain contained in the reactive mind is normally severe. The usual parental punishments, family complications, reprimands, minor accidents, and the battle of the individual with his environment influence, but do not cause, a reactive mind. Nor do these things have the power to change materially the reactions of an individual. In the background of any individual exist many hidden personalities contained in the reactive mind. Dealing in identities, the reactive mind often confuses identities of individuals. Therefore, irrational attachments and antipathies are formed by aberrated individuals who can often find no reason for such attachments or antipathies in their contemporary environment. The content of an engram is literally interpreted, not as it was stated to the unconscious individual, but as it was received in its most literal phraseology and perception. The organism possesses many inherent mechanisms and abilities by which it can learn or preserve or forward itself along the dynamic. Any one of them may be exaggerated by engrams to a point where it becomes an actual threat to the organism or aberrates it. Engrams can and do aberrate all the sensory perceptions, any and all parts of the body, and the mind itself. By demanding suicide, the engram can destroy the entire organism. The error of the reactive mind was introduced by the evolution of speech, for which the basic mechanism was not designed. When all perceptics save speech formed the reactive mind, it was to some degree serviceable. With speech came such complexities of perception and such interchanges of ideas that a whole series of illusions and delusions could be derived from the reactive mind's necessity to determine identities for purposes of emergency. Without the reactive type mind, survival would be extremely difficult, since it must be there to care for emergencies during moments of dispersal of the analytical mind by shock or other means. With speech, the reactive mind came to possess far more power and extensive content. The analytical mind, being a delicate mechanism in some respects, no matter how rugged and capable in others, then could become subjected to delusions and illusions, which, however shadowy and unreal, must nevertheless be obeyed. By stripping the reactive mind of its past painful content, the analytical mind may be placed in complete command of the organism. The moment a man or a group becomes possessed of this ability, it becomes possessed of self-determinism. So long as these possess reactive minds, irrationalities will persist. Because it contains literal speech, no reactive mind can be conceived to be of any value whatsoever to the rational organism. Since the methods of that reactive mind remain intact and will continue to act to preserve the organism in times of unconsciousness of the analytical mind, there is no residual good in any reactive mind. It is capable of any illusion. It has no assist power along the dynamics, save only to cancel or modify other reactive mind content. The source of the individual's power and purpose is not derived from the reactive mind, but from the basic dynamic and from the four dynamics. Any auditor will establish this to his own satisfaction after he has cleared a very few cases. When an individual is attempting to hold on to his aberrations, the auditor may be assured that that person has, as part of the content of the reactive mind, such phrases as "don't dare get rid of it," which identically translated apparently applies to aberrations. It may in fact apply in an engram containing an attempted abortion. The identity factor in the reactive mind may cause the analytical mind to respond irrationally to treatment, and to justify the aberrations in many irrational ways. Whatever means he uses or statements he makes to avoid the exhaustion of his reactive mind is contained exactly in the reactive mind as a positive suggestion, and has no application whatsoever in rational thought. Individuality, if by that is meant a man's desires and habits, is not traced to the reactive mind, save when by individuality is meant those flagrant eccentricities which pass in Dickens for characters. A man is much more individual after his reactive mind has been cleared. Part 2. Auditing. Chapter 9. The Auditor's Code. Not because it is a pleasant thing to do, or because it is a noble idea, the auditor must always treat a pre-clear in a certain definite way which can be outlined as the auditor's code. Failure to follow this code will cause trouble to the auditor, will considerably lengthen and disturb his work, and may endanger the pre-clear. Pre-clear, an individual entered upon Dianetic therapy, auditing, for the purpose of being cleared. The auditor, in the first place, at the optimum, should be himself a clear. Otherwise he will find that many of his own engrams are restimulated as he listens to the engrams of his pre-clears. This restimulation may cause his own engrams to become chronic, victimizing him with various allergies and delusions, and causing him to be, at best, extremely uncomfortable. An auditor can audit while he himself is being cleared, as this is a peculiar and special method of locating his own engrams, since they become restimulated. Becoming painful to him, they can be found and speedily removed. Even if he is not himself cleared, the auditor must act like a clear toward the pre-clear. The auditor's code is the natural activity of a clear. The auditor must act toward the pre-clear exactly in the way that the pre-clear, as an organism, would desire that his own conscious analytical mind would react to and consider the organism. An affinity must therefore be maintained at all costs. The auditor must never permit himself to lose his temper, become aggravated, to scold or badger or antagonize the pre-clear in any way. To do so would not merely disturb the comfort of the pre-clear, but might additionally derange him, and might even prohibit further beneficial auditing by that auditor. The code is nearly Christ-like. The auditor must be confident in that he must continually reassure the pre-clear when restimulated engrams cause despondency on the pre-clear's part. A cheerful, optimistic presence encourages the pre-clear through his most painful experiences. The auditor must be courageous, never permitting himself to be intimidated by either the aggression or hostility of the pre-clear. The auditor must be kind, never indulging in hostilities or personal prejudices. The auditor must be trustworthy, never betraying or capriciously denying a pre-clear, and above all, never breaking his word to the pre-clear. An auditor must be clean, for personal odors or bad breath may be restimulators to the pre-clear, or may disturb him. The auditor must take care not to offend the concepts or sensibilities of the pre-clear. The auditor must be persistent, never permitting the case of the pre-clear to either resist him or to remain unsolved until it is in a proper tone 4, since the restimulation of engrams is a malady unto itself, unless they are being properly exhausted. The auditor must be patient, never hurrying or harassing the pre-clear beyond the needs of stirring an engram into view. He must be willing to work at any and all times necessary, for the length of time necessary to exhaust the engram in process of elimination. In addition to these things, it may be remarked that a definite affinity is established between the auditor and pre-clear during the time of auditing. In the case of opposite sexes, this affinity may amount to an infatuation. The auditor must remain aware of this, and know that he can and should redirect the infatuation to some person or activity other than himself when auditing is at end. Not to do so is to produce an eventual situation wherein the pre-clear may have to be rebuffed, with consequent trouble for the auditor at the end of therapy. Chapter 10. Auditing. The auditing technique consists of assisting the preclear's analytical mind with the auditor's analytical mind. The auditor then functions during each successive period of auditing, and only during the periods of auditing, as an additional analytical mind of the preclear. The reactive mind was received during the dispersal or inactivity of the analytical mind. The reactive mind is removed by returning the preclear to the engram and laying its contents before the scrutiny of the analytical mind. The technique of auditing is done in what is called a Dianetic reverie. The preclear sits in a comfortable chair with arms, or lies on a couch in a quiet room where perceptic distractions are minimal. The auditor tells him to look at the ceiling. The auditor says, "When I count from 1 to 7, your eyes will close." The auditor then counts from 1 to 7 and keeps counting quietly and pleasantly until the preclear closes his eyes. This is the entire routine. Consider it more a signal that proceedings are to begin and a means of concentrating the preclear on his own concerns and the auditor than anything else. This is not hypnotism. It is vastly different. The preclear knows everything which is going on around him. He is not asleep, and he can bring himself out of it any time he likes. The auditor makes very sure that the preclear is not hypnotized by telling him before he begins to count, "You will know everything which goes on. You will be able to remember everything that happens. You can exercise your own control. If you do not like what is happening, you can instantly pull out of it. Now, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc." In reverie, the next words of the auditor should be devoted to the installing of a canceller. This should be worded in such a way that it will furnish a key word, which when spoken at the end of therapy will cancel every slightest remark or suggestion made by the auditor while the preclear was in reverie. This is a guarantee that no positive suggestions will be left residual in the mind of the preclear through the inadvertent or accidental slips attendant to auditing. Such a canceller should also cancel the reverie, being worded with sufficient generality to take in anything and everything the auditor may say to the preclear during the entire period of therapy. At no time should the auditor permit the preclear to be under the delusion that he is being treated by hypnosis. This is mentioned because hypnotism is a current fad, and the principles of Dianetics have nothing whatever to do with hypnotism. Both are based upon simple natural laws, but have between them an enormous gulf. One is the tool of the charlatan, and the other is the science of the human mind. Returning is employed in Dianetic therapy. Returning is the method of retaining the body and the awareness of the preclear in present time, while he is told to go back to a certain incident. Dates are not mentioned. His size is not mentioned. Various means are used to restimulate his memory. Any of the perceptics may be employed to return him to some period of his past. He is told simply to go back to the time when blank. He is returned and made to recount what he can of the incident. He is told he is right there, and that he can recall this. Little else is said by the auditor, save those hints necessary to return the preclear to the proper time. Wide awake, he can return to moments in the past. The preclear is not allowed at any moment to revivify in that period, since the data is drained as a surcharge from his time track to present time. He is told that he can remember this, but he is never told that he can remember this in present time, since that will occasion the somatics to return to present time. Most of the data is located by observing some somatic pain in the individual, or some somatic aberration, and seeking to discover wherein it was received. The somatics are employed primarily because the motor controls possess a less disturbed time track than the sensory strip. It must be remembered that there is no aberration without an accompanying somatic. The somatics alone, being physical ills of one sort or another, hold the aberrated content of the reactive mind in place. The motor controls can be returned to a period, although the conscious or analytical mind believes itself to be entirely in present time. By talking to the muscles, or motor controls, or various bodily aches and pains, the auditor can shift them at will up and down their time track. This time track is not connected to the analytical mind and speech, but is apparently a parallel time track, with greater reliability than the sensory track. The precision of data contained in the motor control time track is enormous. Muscles can be made to tense or relax. Coughs, aches, and pains can be made to come and go simply by uttering the right words for the engram, or the wrong words. It is the primary task of the auditor to cause the time tracks of the motor strip and the sensory strip to come into parallel. That the time track exists in the strips has not been proven, but they can so be considered for the purposes of this explanation. That they exist is extremely apparent. The motor strip time track can be asked questions down to the smallest moment of time, and the area of an engram can at times be so located. Its character can also be determined. The lie detector, the encephalograph, and many other means are useful in determining both the character and the extent of the engrams, since into these can be fed the restimulators of the preclear. A codified restimulator list can be created, which will be found to be common to most preclears. It should include all types of illnesses, accidents, the common trite phrases of the society, and names of various persons who commonly surround a child during his childhood. Such a codified restimulator list would be extremely valuable in therapy, and every auditor can compose his own. These are best composed after the auditing of the individual preclear and after inquiry into his life to determine the various irrationalities of thought. In that engrams are identity thought, the remarks of the preclear about his engrams will be found to be included in the content of those engrams. When the preclear is asked to imagine a bad situation at certain ages and under hypothetical conditions, he will very often deliver up a complete engram. The auditor must realize that every remark that a preclear makes while he is being made to go over his reactive mind is probably some part of the content of that reactive mind. That mind is literal. The words the preclear uses when referring to it must be literally evaluated. Chapter 11. Diagnosis. It is a useful and positive principle that whatever confronts or contests the analytical mind of the preclear will also confront and contest the analytical mind of the auditor. When the auditor is acting as an additional analytical mind of the preclear, whatever emotion or antagonism is directed toward him is the emotion or antagonism which is directed by the reactive mind toward the preclear's own analytical mind. If a preclear cannot hear what people are saying in his engrams, he has another engram about can't hear. If he cannot feel anything in his engram, it is because he has an engram about can't feel. If he cannot see, he has an engram about not being able to see, and so forth. If he cannot return, he has an engram about going back, or returning to childhood, or some such thing. If he is doubtful and skeptical about what is happening or what has happened to him, it is because he has an engram about being doubtful and skeptical. If he is antagonistic, his reactive mind contains a great deal of antagonism. If he is self-conscious or embarrassed, it is because his reactive mind contains self-consciousness or embarrassment. If he insists on maintaining his own control, refusing to do what the auditor tells him to do, it is because he has an engram about self-control, and so forth and so on. This is identity thought. All this is used in diagnosis. Auditing is the best method of learning the problems of the preclear. Trying to work the preclear into returning, hearing, seeing, feeling, going back and forward, and taking due note of what he says about the entire process will form a rather complete diagnosis on one who is not insane. Questioning the preclear as to what is wrong with him will elicit replies straight out of his principal engrams. Listening to an endless justification of his actions is both a delay and a waste of time. But listening to what he has to say about what he thinks has happened to him, or what he is afraid of, is of definite value. Insane persons form and pose a slightly different but essentially the same problem. It is a clinically established observation that the reactive mind is relatively shallow. Below it lies the basic personality of the individual, no matter how insane he may be. Therefore, by one means or another, a rational being may be reached within a preclear, a being who is not aberrated. Here it can be established what the preclear really wants, what he hopes, what he actually feels. It has been observed that no matter what his raving state, providing his brain structure is normal and complete, the basic personality is entirely sound and sane, and will cooperate. After auditing, the pre-clear will become this strong, competent, and able personality. The reactive mind, when unable to exert itself to its aberrated full in the environment of the pre-clear, will break the pre-clear, or cause him to lose tone. Therefore, it is of definite interest to discover what immediately preceded the break of the pre-clear, or what is currently causing him unhappiness. Something is dispersing his dynamics. The probability is that he has a chronic restimulator in his vicinity. Wives, husbands, mothers, fathers, superiors, etc., can be the source of such breaking, since they turn the purpose of the reactive mind, which pretends to desire above all else the best interest of the pre-clear, back upon the pre-clear himself. Thus, these sources cause the pre-clear to lower back into the tone of the reactive mind, apathy, or a low tone too. The problem of the fixed person and the problem of the sympathy engram are both visible in the aberrated individual. The identity thought of the reactive mind has taken some part of the person of some individual in the pre-clear's current environment and referred it to some part of the person of an individual in the pre-clear's engramic past. The discovery of this identity is one of the principal problems of therapy. The sympathy engram is of a very specific nature, being the effort of the parent or guardian to be kind to a child who is severely hurt. If that parent or guardian has shown the child antagonism prior to the time of the injury, the adult pre-clear is prone to reactivate the injury in the presence of the identity personality with whom he is now associated. This causes many somatic ills to present themselves in the present. Only the exact words of a sympathy engram will soothe the aberrated personality. There are not many personality types. A human being learns through mimicry. If his own self is found to be too painful, he can become another self, and very often does. A tone 4 can become people at will without being aberrated about it, thus enjoying books and plays by being the person portrayed. But an aberrated individual can become part of the engramic cast of his reactive mind, and so solve all of his problems in such an aberrated fashion. Aberrated people are not themselves, since they do not possess their own determinism. As has been stated, those emotions, doubts, worries, and problems which confront the auditor when attempting to work the pre-clear while returned will lead the auditor into the basic content of the reactive mind. There are certain definite manifestations which can be suspected and certain routines which follow every case. Every human being has been carried in the womb, and every human being has been born. The discovery of the basic engram is extremely necessary for the commencement of auditing. Finding the basic engram is like taking the enemy in the flank. There is nothing before it. Therefore, the end most remote from the adult life of the individual is the end most exposed for the attack of the auditor. In the basic engram, the pre-clear can see, feel, hear, and freely emote. When he is returned to later incidents, it may be found that he cannot do these things, no matter how hard the auditor works to enable him to do so. By pursuing the engram chain up its chronological sequence, this ability will be restored. Therefore, it is necessary, first and foremost, to locate the basic engram. This may, in some few cases, lie later than birth. In the majority of the cases, it will be found to lie at or before birth. No discussion is here entered about the ability of the human mind to remember at such remote periods. It can be stated, however, that when engramic data does exist, the time track is opened by pain and antagonism at these extreme points, and can be contacted and exhausted. The analytical mind is not present at these moments. Quite in addition to this, the engrams are not even on the open time track. It is with the greatest difficulty that the auditor will find the basic engram. Since it is ordinarily quite painful, and the scanning mechanism has as its purpose, or one of its purposes, the avoidance of pain, it will not easily reach them. Like the scanning mechanism on a cathode ray tube, the scanners of the analytical mind sweep over, skipping and not touching, the data on the engram chain. By various means, the auditor must then force the pre-clear scanners to contact that data and force the data back onto the time track, where it can be properly exhausted. Light prenatals are the best possible approach to a case. When the only prenatal is an extremely heavy one, or an attempted abortion, which by the way are very common, the auditor must use a great deal of guile. It can be said that the basic engram and the beginning of the actual engram chain is early, before, near, or during birth, is painful, and will not be easily contacted. In that few preclears have more than a score of serious engrams, the task is light when once begun, but requires a great deal of imagination and persuasion. A prenatal must always be suspected unless birth, when lifted, rises easily into a tone 4. If none of the engrams will rise into a tone 4, the auditor would suppose that he has not discovered the basic. There are 3 kinds of engrams: the precursor, the engram, and the follower. By engram, here is meant that experience which the auditor has found and is working upon. If it does not seem to be lifting after a few recountings, a precursor must be suspected and returned to. In this way, an earlier basic may be discovered. But it is a fruitless task and wasted energy to attempt to work anything but a basic. Blows in the womb, attempted abortions, and birth are the usual basics. These must be exhausted to their fullest degree before other engrams are even glanced at. The advantage of this is that everyone has a birth. Birth can be looked for. If it is not quickly found and if it does not develop on examination, then an earlier experience must be suspected and located if possible. In this way, the prenatals may be discovered. Easily, the most important are the prenatals. When a child is abnormally afraid of the dark, he probably has a prenatal experience. This prenatal experience will include all the sound data and sensory data of the incident. It is eidetic and identical. The preclear will have somatics. These, on the first few recountings, will be ordinarily faint, and then become more severe as more data is located. The data will finally be, in more or less, a complete state, and the engram will begin to lift, rising up through the various tones. All prenatals are apathy experiences, and are therefore serious. Minor taps and discomforts in the womb are of no consequence. A true engram will consist of such a thing as a knitting needle being rammed through the fetus, half of the fetus's head being badly injured, blows of various kinds bringing about fetal unconsciousness, and so forth. Returning will find an opening into any period when there has been pain. Disbeliefs and antagonisms from the preclear on the subject of such a thing as an attempted abortion should be overlooked by the auditor, or taken into account as the sign of an existing engram. A case is recalled wherein a girl insisted that if an abortion had ever been attempted on her, it should have been successful. Through several sessions, while an attempt was made to lift birth, she continued this assertion, until the auditor realized that this was probably a remark made by the abortionist, or the mother, when his efforts failed. As soon as this was suggested to the girl, she was able to at last reach the incident with its somatics without any further suggestion from the auditor. A chronic apathy case under treatment for some years in an institution, she suddenly responded to treatment, brought the abortion to tone 4, erased birth to tone 4, and recovered mentally and physically into a social asset well above normal. The auditor should continue to suspect prenatals so long as he cannot get later engrams easily into tone 4. Once an engram chain has been lifted at its end nearest to conception, the preclear should begin to clear relatively automatically, aided but little by the auditor. The clear should be in terms of laughter at its optimum. This laughter is the reversing of charges, residual in the locks and engram locks, which depended for their fear content or antagonistic content upon the basic engrams. Little engramic data of any importance is to be found after the age of 10, although a serious operation or accident might provide one. The bulk of the engram data will be found before the age of 2. The most important data is ordinarily in the period of infancy, birth, or prenatal, with the latter containing the preponderance of the important data. Abortion attempts are easy to recognize when an auditor has had some experience. The parent who attempted the abortion will after birth likely be a source of anxiety to the individual, who seems to require a great deal of affection and attention from that parent. the individual will be found to be most fond of the parent or other who did not aid or who actually tried to prevent the abortion attempt. At this time, abortion attempts are extremely common. When an abortion attempt has been lifted, the engram chain should easily be brought to the time track and exhausted by the auditor. Auditing is essentially very simple, but it demands precise understanding of the principles involved and imagination and sympathy on the part of the auditor. He must learn to compute engrammically, or learn to think with his analytical mind, only for the purposes of therapy to others, engrammically. His biggest problem is the discovery of the actual basic. It may elude him for a considerable period of time. There is other preparatory work to do in a case than the discovery of the basic. Occasionally, an entire time track must be rehabilitated in cases in which "do not remember" and "can't remember" have obscured the track. A few later locks can be found and exhausted in the same manner that engrams are exhausted, and the track can be restored. The hysteria or fear of the individual can be momentarily allayed one way or the other, and the problem of reaching the basic can be entered upon. There are as many types of cases as there are cases, but these are the primary fundamentals. An auditor must think his way through every case, taking as his data the constantly reiterated statements of the pre-clear during auditing, and accumulating experience as to how incidents can be thrust off the time track, burying them from sight of the analytical mind, thus forming a reactive mind to the detriment of the organism. Chapter 12. Exhaustion of engrams. The technique of exhausting an engram is not complicated, but it must be adhered to. An engram is an unconscious moment containing physical pain and conceived or actual antagonism to the organism. Therefore, that engram, before it is discovered, will exhibit antagonism toward the auditor trying to discover it. When it is first discovered, it may be found to be lacking in its essential data. There are many techniques by which this data can be developed. In a prenatal engram, the analytical mind apparently must redevelop the situation. Many returns to the incident are therefore necessary. The pre-clear is returned to the incident and is told that the next time he is returned to this place, he will remember everything about the incident. He is then taken up to present time and addressed on some other subject. Immediately after, he is returned to the supposed basic. It will be found to contain a little more data. This is then recounted. If after 2 or 3 repeated recountings of the data, it is still found to be in a low tone, the pre-clear is told when returned that he will remember all this the next time he is brought back to this spot. By advancing him to a happy period and finding that he is then happy, the data is sealed in. After from 1 to 3 days, the basic data will be found to have developed to a considerable extent. It is then exhausted again, and its behavior noted. If it will not rise easily, many things may be present. The first thing the auditor should suspect is a precursor. It is actually possible for a follower to contain essential information which will not permit the information to rise. In the course of auditing, when an engram is restimulated by the auditor but will not rise above apathy, and does not seem to contain all the necessary data, the auditor must look for a precursor, and it almost inevitably will be found to exist. This precursor is then developed as the basic engram. If it follows the same behavior pattern of not lifting or becoming complete, another precursor to it must be discovered. If at last the auditor is entirely certain that there is no engram ahead of the one being cleared, some possible locking mechanism later on may be found and exhausted, at which time the basic may show itself. Continual application of energy to the basic will at length bring it into full view, and continual recountings of it will gradually develop it, raise its tone, and lift it into tone 4. The principle of recounting is very simple. The pre-clear is merely told to go back to the beginning and to tell it all over again. He does this many times. As he does it, the engram should lift in tone on each recounting. It may lose some of its data and gain other. If the pre-clear is recounting in the same words time after time, it is certain that he is playing a memory record of what he has told you before. He must then be sent immediately back to the actual engram, and the somatics of it must be restimulated. He will then be found to somewhat vary his story. He must be returned to the consciousness of somatics continually until these are fully developed, begin to lighten, and are then gone. Tone 4 will appear shortly afterward. If the preclear is bored with the incident and refuses to go on with it, there is either a precursor or there is other data in the engram which has not been located. The auditor will occasionally discover that an engram, when lifted into a tone 3, or even erased without reaching laughter, will sag. This is a certain sign of a precursor. Any kind of sag from a tone 4 is impossible if tone 4 has truly been reached. Tone 4 will not be reached if there are precursors. The engram may vanish and be erased, but there will be no cheerfulness or laughter about it at the end if it has a precursor. Once the basic engram has been reached and brought into tone 4, it will disappear. The next engram on the chain will be located and rather easily brought into tone 4. If one is accidentally skipped, the third in line will be found to hold or sag. The intermediate must then be located and brought into a tone 4. In such a way, the engram chain will gradually come up into a complete tone 4. At this time, it will begin to automatically clear the locks, the merely mentally painful incidents in the person's life. These will clear without any attention from the auditor. While these are clearing, the auditor must concern himself with engram locks. These would be engrams on their own if they had not had precursors. They therefore do not relieve after the removal of the basic, but must be located as themselves. These in turn will start a chain of releasing locks, which again need no attention. There may be entirely distinct engram chains in the reactive mind, which are not appended in any way to the original basic engram. So long as a preclear contains any part of a reactive mind, he will be interested in himself, in the condition of his mind, and introverted. Therefore, so long as he is interested in his own reactive mind, he has engrams. A guarantee of a tone 4 is the preclear's interest in positive action along his dynamics, and his application of himself to the world around him. Introversion is not natural, nor is it necessary to the creation of anything. It is a manifestation of the analytical mind trying to solve problems on improper data and observing the organism being engaged in activities which are not conducive to survival in the 4 dynamics. When a clear has been reached, the basic personality of the individual will have asserted itself and its self-determinism. No somatics chronic in the present will remain, excepting those which can be accounted for by actual disease, injury, or malconstruction of the brain. Though more germane to child Dianetics, it is of help to the auditor to know that a child can be considered to have formed his general basic purpose in life somewhere around the age of 2. This purpose is fairly reliable, as at that time his engrams have probably not gained much force over him, since his responsibilities are slight. He will have tried to hold his main purpose throughout his life, but it will undoubtedly have been warped, both by his reactive mind's experience content and by his environment. The discovery of this purpose is obtained by Dianetic revivification and the questioning of the 2-year-old child. The time when the purpose is formed varies and may indeed never have manifested, as in the case of amentias. As the preclear is normally interested in this purpose and its rehabilitation, he will often take a more intense interest in therapy if there is an attempt made to discover the purpose. This purpose is quite valid, and the preclear can be expected to rehabilitate his life along its dictates, unless he is too oppressed by his environment, although it can be remarked that a clear will ordinarily order or change his environment until he has rehabilitated himself. Vocational therapies have as their source the tenet of the rehabilitation of the general purpose of an individual, or the establishment of a false purpose in order to allay the activity of his reactive mind. It has little bearing on abnormal Dianetics, and belongs more properly in medical Dianetics. But an auditor for the term of therapy may engage his preclear along the purpose line of becoming a clear. This is not necessary, and is indeed often automatic, since the basic personality beholds at last a chance to manifest itself. However, It will occasionally aid the auditor. The auditor should be prepared to have to solve many individual problems, since above these basics are almost as many problems as there are cases. For example, in the case of a preclear who has several prenatals, it will be found that the formation of the body in the womb has overlaid or confused the time track, so that a later prenatal must be partially lifted before an earlier prenatal can be exhausted. This is often true of a later period of life. In one case, an entire series of prenatals was held down by a dental operation under nitrous oxide at the age of 25. Until some portion of the dental operation was removed, the bulk of the prenatals were not available. In short, the circuits of the mind can become entangled, to a point where even the motor control time track is confused. Dispersal of purpose by some engram along some dynamic or purpose line is a common situation, and is indeed the basic concept. As a stream of electrons would behave if they were to encounter a solid object in their path, so does a dynamic or purpose disperse. These many varied and faint tracks after impact with the engram are symptomatic. Along dynamic 2, the sexual dynamic, promiscuity inevitably and invariably indicates a sexual engram of great magnitude. Once that engram is removed, promiscuity can be expected to cease. Anxiety is established in the preclear's mind by such dispersals, and he dramatizes because of the dispersal. This is one of the manifestations of his malady. No pervert ever became a pervert without having been educated or abused by a pervert, and that abuse must have been very thorough. The contagion of engrams is an interesting manifestation which the auditor should and must observe. It can be said that insanity runs in families, not because this is a eugenic truth, but because a standard pattern during emergencies or stress creates certain types of engrams, which in turn create types of insanities. Insanities are so definitely contagious that when a child is raised by aberrated parents, he himself becomes aberrated. As would be delineated by infant and child Dianetics, the best way to guarantee a sane child is to provide it with clear parents. This is of definite interest to the auditor, since he will discover that in cases of a severe prenatal in birth, the engrams were also received by the mother, exactly as they were received by the child. The child will thereafter be a restimulator to the mother, and the mother a restimulator to the child for the severe incidents. The mother, having received the exact wording of the engram, also contains the engram. Restimulation by the child will occasion the use of the engramic language toward the child. This brings the infant and child and adolescent into the unhappy situation of having his birth engram or his prenatal engram continually restimulated. This occasions dire results and very great unhappiness in the home, and is one of the main sources of family difficulties. A child, even if he despises them, will dramatize the actions of his parents when he himself is married and when he himself has children. In addition to this, the other partner in the marriage also has his or her own engrams. Their engrams combine into doubled engrams in the children. The result of this is a contagion and a progression of aberration. Thus, any society which does not have a high purpose finds itself declining and gaining to itself greater numbers of insane. Since the contagion of aberrations is at work progressively, the children become progressively aberrated, until at last the society itself is aberrated. While the fate of society belongs definitely in social and political Dianetics, the auditor is interested in the fact that he can take the prenatal and birth content of the engrams of his preclear and run them to discover post-birth locks and engram locks. The mother will normally have used much the same data whenever the troubles of the child impinged upon her reactive mind. This, of course, accounts for the locks. The auditor will also discover that where he is a married preclear who is aberrated, he should have two preclears, which is to say, the partner. It is useless to return a clear to his or her aberrated spouse and expect domestic tranquility to result. While the clear cannot and will not pick up his old engrams from the spouse in whom he has implanted them, he will nevertheless find his life aberrated by the mere existence of a spouse that he himself may have aberrated. Further, The children of these people will also need clearing, since they will be found, if the parents' aberrations were of any magnitude, to be sickly or aberrated or deficient in some way. The auditor should therefore, when he undertakes a case, be prepared to assume the family of his pre-clear, should an investigation of that pre-clear make it seem necessary. Aberrations are contagious, and where a person has been aberrated, that environment will to some degree also have become aberrated. The pre-clear may, for one thing, be somewhat victimized and aberrated by his reactive mind, which is now existing in his associates. The auditor should not permit such terms as psychoneurotic, crazy, or mentally exhausted to exist for long in the pre-clear's mind. These are depressant and are actually aberrations in the society. It is true and provable that the pre-clear is on his way to being not a person who is crazy or neurotic, but an individual who will have more stability and self-command and ability possibly than those around him. To be blunt, this is not the process of reviving corpses into a semblance of life. It is a process which, at its best usage, is taking the normal and average and giving them their birthright of happiness and creative attainment in the world of man. Chapter 13. The Analyzer. A proper understanding of the approximate working principles of the analytical mind is as necessary to the auditor as an understanding of the character and content of the reactive mind. It can be said, if only for illustration, that the analytical mind is sharply distinct from the remainder of the mind in the body. It can be considered to be the location of the individual's highest echelon in the awareness of now. In the human being, it is the location of high directional control. In the optimum state of the individual, it possesses the entire self-determinism for the organism. As its energy potential is reduced, and its circuits crowded with data of a non-essential nature, which it finds necessary to maintain a continued control, if of a limited extent, of the organism, this determinism is usurped by lower echelon mechanisms, such as the reactive mind. The theory of determinism by stimuli and experience is true of the lower orders of command mechanisms as it is in animals. It is distinctly not true of the analytical mind. Herein may be said to reside an individual's self-determinism, which is highly selective and self-motivated. It has not only the power of choice in action, it also possesses the ability to create stimuli. It can be considered for purposes of analogy as the seat of the four dynamics. Injured or jammed with extraneous data, it chooses to impede various of these dynamics. It has imagination, it can dream, it can create, and it is capable of origin in any plane, and is capable additionally of creating life and matter. Although it may not have done so at this writing, its ability to do so is apparent in enormous progress in that direction. It runs upon the principle that it can solve any problem which it can state. But appreciation of the analytical mind does not depend upon its observed abilities in the creations of a society. It is easily the greatest and most powerful calculator ever known. It can pose itself its own problems, and it can invent problems which are far removed from either necessity or observation. It is unlimited. It is a magnificent entity. Billions of words telegraphically composed could not begin to list its achievements and potentials. It is additionally conceived, for brevity in this parody, as being the primary and optimum residence of I. Its activity can be delineated by the heuristic axioms of the first chapter. The dynamic and the various dynamics are its only concern. The analytical mind does not contain engrams. It contains only locks. No pain is residual in the analytical mind beyond a restimulative somatic received in the same manner that it would be received and held by any other organ of the body. The engrams do not intrude into the analytical mind. An entirely different process is observably at work. By various conduits, the reactive mind is in full command of moments of pain. It is a lower echelon, immediacy-type mind, and can be considered to embrace all the cellular structure of the organism, including the reflexive subbrains. It runs on exterior determinism and reacts on the plan of A equals A equals A. It can come into being only when the analytical mind is disorganized or dispersed by exterior forceful means. The analytical mind may be considered to obtain no direct data from the reactive mind. The entire content of the reactive mind is completely unknown to the analytical mind in any direct fashion. As the analytical mind was not functioning during its receipt, the analytical mind, on regaining control of the organism, has no connection with the reactive mind. This single apparent weakness of the analytical mind, that it can be rendered unconscious or dispersed, is a survival mechanism obviously necessary to the organism. There are various reasons for this. It is charged with the command of the dynamics. It cannot consent to the error or injury of the mechanism, which inability is inherent in its primary purpose. It cannot permit the organism to err, and when error is introduced, it is the first organ of the body to succumb to extreme shocks. Among others, there is a purely structural reason. Shock waves carrying along the nerve channels will disconnect and disrupt the most sensitive nerve area of the body first. Drugs will also produce their maximum effect upon the most sensitive nerve area. The analytical mind is the first affected by shock and drugs. On examination, it will be found to contain fuse mechanisms, which preserve it from lasting damage. While it is fantastically sturdy, fantastically able, it is not physiologically stable in the presence of shock or drugs, the latter being at best poisons. The analytical mind has various methods of performing its duties. It can teach itself to think and compute new and outrageously complex methods of computation, and then use them to solve problems which it poses to itself, as well as problems which originate in the past, the present, or the future environment. It can also originate these environments. As has been elsewhere noted, its problems may be classified into two groups: obtaining pleasure and solving pain along any one of the four dynamics. It has nothing to do with the insanity of the organism. It is the first and most interesting case of the contagious character of aberrations. It can control at will any and all portions of the body, any fluid or excretion in the body, and along other dynamics, many other energy forms. To do this, it must solve their menaces and obtain pleasures. It works on observed or imagined data. The imagined or dream data is not aberrated within the analytical mind, but is aberrated data only on the basis of observed reactions. It observes that its charges are in pain. There are 5 ways in which it can work solutions about that pain. The pain is actual, according to the computations of the analytical mind, when the organism or charges along the other dynamics are observed to be reacting, as to a menace, and as in pain. The analyzer is quite adept at throwing out of itself erroneous data. An erroneous datum can only be introduced into a non-pathologic analytical mind by the indirect fact that the pain may not be actual in the organism or other charges. But upon these continually insisting that pain exists, it becomes incumbent upon the analytical mind to bring forth a solution to that pain. Thus, the content of the analytical mind possesses no direct engram. The analytical mind does not feel the pain itself, unless the pain happens to be in the particular cellular area in which it exists and impinges against its own cellular structure. The eye is told on certain circuits that the organism is in pain, and it observes the fact through sensory perception. In a similar manner, the analytical mind observes that, for instance, a companion individual is injured. It then begins to pose and solve problems regarding that injury. The injury might be non-existent. The companion might only suppose himself to be currently in pain, nevertheless feeling that pain as real. Despite this dissimulation, the analytical mind will endeavor to observe all the data surrounding that pain and to solve the problems relating to it, alleviating it and bettering the companion's present and future chances of survival. A new thought process may be evolved in such a case, and the memory of the observation may be stored in the memory banks. This memory contains in itself no actual pain beyond what has been perceived in an analytical fashion. The reactive mind causes the organism or the entities on other dynamics to simulate pain. In order to enforce engrammic commands in a blunt and identity method of survival, portions of the organism or other entities may be made to feel actual pain, or may be forcefully limited in food supply or other fluid or necessity service. The exteriorly induced command reacts against the organism or other entities in exactly the pattern and with the perceptics that it was received. The analytical mind is informed on a separate circuit that the organism or other entities are in pain and that it must resolve the problem. It observes all the surrounding conditions of the incident or the misery and with this perfectly valid data evolves some solution. The less analytical mind present during such moments, the lower the solution is on its own echelon, and the less rational that solution will be, which is to say that less computive power has been exerted against the problem. But the entire analytical mind is rational. It is inherently rational. It does not use erroneous data in its computations whenever it is possible to avoid such use. And whenever a datum has been found to be erroneous, the analytical mind discharges the entire circuit of that solution. When engrams are present in the reactive mind, they come into activation during moments of low potentiality, weariness, drug or trance condition in the analytical mind, but are always to some degree observed by the analytical mind, save when that organ is completely unconscious. Even when only a small amount of the analytical mind's potential is present, and the reactive mind is throwing the organism or other entities into aberrated dramatizations, the analytical mind observes, often with incredulity, the action which is taking place. It sees in this action a problem. It attempts to find solutions, and because it is built to resolve solutions on observed as well as conceived data, it soon finds itself in an enormous maze of circuits and complexities which are laid and counterlaid to resolve the problems posed by the dramatization. This observed conduct may be so aberrated that the analytical mind at length finds it necessary to achieve often fantastic solutions. These can include any and all of the insanities. But the analytical mind is never insane, even though it may be nulled for years by the reactive mind and a perceptic which includes the unconsciousness of the analytical mind. The one common perceptic to all engrams is the dispersal or absence of the analytical mind. They were received at a moment when the analytical mind was unconscious. They therefore contain a datum which states that when restimulators such and so are present, the analytical mind is unconscious. When the analytical mind is low in potentiality, or the being low in general tone, it loses some of its control by the simple equation of the comparative energies. One or more perceptics in an engram being restimulated, a further organic perceptive of the absence of the analytical mind is reactivated, and circuits are thrown into activity, which include a further reduction of the analytical mind. In this way, the analytical mind loses power and command over the organism or the entities it has in its charge. In a dramatization which includes its suppression or absence, the analytical mind is still in existence, awake and alive in its fullest power, but with all its circuits disengaged as they connect to the body. Insanity is a simple or compound dramatization. Neuroses, compulsions, and repressions are the efforts of the analytical mind to reach solutions on observed data with the reactive mind in partial command of the organism. This is not, then, a condition of integration, and as many personalities may be posed as there are current dramatizations of engrams in the reactive mind. It is an almost fabulous fact that the analytical mind is constructively and uniformly good in its intent. To reach the reactive mind, it is necessary to assist the analytical mind so that the reactive personality may be reached. There is, of course, no more actuality in the reactive personality than there is actuality in engrams. These are shadow things, soldered to the body by some painful past experience. This experience includes the partial or complete dispersal of the potential of the analytical mind. In an insane, neurotic, or aberrated individual, it is always possible to lull the reactive mind and reach the slumbering and partially or completely detached and dispersed analytical mind. This presents the remarkable picture of finding within the most vicious, criminal, or insane organism a completely sane, concerned, and constructively good basic personality. The I is never absent, but may be disconnected, still trying to solve the problems of the organism or the entities with which it is charged, but unable to exert its commands. The entire intent and technique of Dianetics is to break the partial or complete suppression of the analytical mind by the exhaustion of the false data contained in the engrams, which compose the reactive mind. When this is done, the analytical mind begins to clear itself, somewhat on the order of an automatic computer, which makes way for new problems. Locks are uniformly contained in the analytical mind as observed data. They are therefore reachable in conscious moments in the not insane individual. Any therapy which addresses the clearing of these locks without consultation with the problem of vanishing the reactive mind is a therapy addressed to a computing mechanism and a powerful eye far more able to solve problems if entirely clear than any mechanical computer which will ever be built. Freudian psychology, for instance, was an effort to clear the circuits of the analytical mind. The locks are contained in the analytical mind as notations of confusions observed in the behavior of the organism, or the entities which that analytical mind has in its area of observation. These locks are mental anguish. Anything which addresses the adjustment of them may allay some of the fears of the analytical mind for the organism. But any such effort will be succeeded by new experiences, which become locks and must be cleared. That a therapy can be addressed to the analytical mind as a therapy of reason is entirely feasible and possible, for the analytical mind will always receive new data and is quite willing to recompute its old. But its old solutions have become memory of action undertaken and are stored additionally in the memory bank, so that there are two files. Any therapy addressing the analytical mind does not disturb the memory bank file of locks, and these are attached to and will lead to the engram file. But this is an extraordinarily difficult and unnecessary proceeding, to clear the analytical mind of data accumulated by observation. It will produce some alleviation of the analytical mind, and even some alleviation of the locks in the memory bank. But it will not and cannot remove the reactive mind, unless the engrams themselves are addressed in an orderly and efficient manner. When the engrams have been exhausted from the reactive mind, all the locks, and even some engram locks in the memory banks, and of course the analytical mind, vanish, since these depended for their existence upon the charge furnished by the engram, whether bypassed into the memory bank or existing as observation. The analytical mind is very well aware of how the mind works, since it must work not only a mind, but the entire organism and the entities and energy forms included in its dynamics. The moment it observes that the reactive mind has been exhausted, and that it is receiving no further pain messages from a certain section, which when restimulated in auditing were anxiously telegraphing for a solution, it automatically rids itself of all extraneous data and circuits, and leaves itself clear for new and rational thought. Exhaustion of the reactive mind apparently leaves many circuits and much potential in a state of new availability. This is noted in the temporary euphorias which result from the exhaustion of single engrams. This temporary euphoria generally collapses as new engrams are approached in the reactive mind, since the general body tone is reduced and the analytical mind is being confronted with new emergency appeals from various portions of the body. When the last engram, and where necessary, engramic type of lock is exhausted from the reactive mind, and therefore the entire organism and the memory banks, the resultant charge can be compared to a reversed polarity. Laughter is rejection. Violent laughter may often occur, as these charges change in the reactive mind and as those circuits are cleared by the analytical mind, which is flicking out its locks. The term clear is used because it is common parlance in the field of computers. The analytical mind, when the reactive mind has been restimulated and exhausted by artificial means, instantly clears itself. This can be considered to make new circuits and computations available. The action does not change in any slightest degree the basic personality of the individual, but delivers to that personality a clear mind, relieved of harmful emotional content, and an organism which is no longer anxiously telegraphing information about false but nevertheless real pain. It is literally true the analytical mind itself is incapable of error. Its only error is introduced by erroneous data received from its observation of engrams at work. In a clear, complete accuracy, enormous imagination, renewed dreaming power, since an aberrated individual apparently loses his ability to dream in inverse ratio to the number of engrams he collects, and above all, the basic dynamic, the four dynamics, and purposes are entirely rehabilitated in full force. The basic purpose of an individual is established at a very early age, and is apparently residual in the analytical mind. In a clear, this purpose comes into full and complete being. His problems no longer have the added complexity of false data, false only in that it was observed as correct, whereas it was false in the reactive mind, and the analytical mind increases markedly in intelligence. It returns to its ability to command the entire organism and the entities which it has in charge, and can resolve with fantastic accuracy and speed, modified only by its educational data recallable from the memory files. Discovering the health of the organism to be immeasurably increased, the glandular activity to be normal or returning to normal, and the capabilities of the organism to be far in excess of what the organism once supposed they were, the analytical mind can begin with great efficiency to perform its proper function. The happiness and pleasurable observation of life, incident in childhood, comes to the adult with the added enhancement of the ability to concentrate, and with the data of long experience. In a clear, the memory files and the analytical mind contain only valid and useful data and circuits. Any individual who contains in his reactive mind an experience of an attempted abortion, or who contains any engrammic data related to the necessity of retaining something, if that suggestion be indefinite, seeks to retain his engrams, and will often justify such a retention, since justification for the conduct of the organism is necessary by the analytical mind, which must not permit the organism to remain in social danger, with the comment that the dynamic results from these engrammic situations. The confusion results from the observation that necessity brings about an address of the analytical mind to new problems. The necessities of the past are not forgotten in a clear, but the false necessities are recognized and eradicated. It has not been resolved what part punishment plays in the formation of a sensitive analytical mind, but it has been resolved that the removal of the reactive mind, which is to say, the removal of physically painful experience from the life of an individual, immeasurably increases both his dynamic force and his intelligence. The value of a reactive mind to the analyzer is exactly 0. Chapter 14. The Clear. The actual operation of the mind, the delineation and measurement of its purposes, as well as its dynamics, belongs properly in the field of dynamic Dianetics. However, the auditor must understand the condition of the clear. When an individual has had his reactive mind exhausted so that he is no longer victimized by erroneous information, his analytical mind, in which resides the I, becomes an integration with the entire organism. As an illustration of this, when the auditor is seeking the basic engram, he will find that the analytical mind, which contains only locks on the engrammic content of the reactive mind, will observe that the I is exteriorly observing the incident in which the organism once took part, until the basic or the basic's immediate chain is reached. This aspect of exterior observation is symptomatic of the disintegrated personality, and is present ordinarily in all aberrated individuals until the basic engram itself is reached, at which time the individual will find himself within himself, feeling his own pains, and participating as himself in the incident. It was during this basic engram that he first began to separate into the illusion of 2 or more individuals. In this wise, all aberrated individuals are split personalities, which is to say, unintegrated personalities. The analytical mind has had its circuits jammed with a great deal of extraneous information and erroneous data, furnished by the reactive mind, and made to serve as a basic purpose to the analytical mind. These purposes, as furnished by the reactive mind, are of the character of positive suggestions of timeless duration, which, when restimulated by perceptions in the environment of the individual, become as new personalities. Actually, it is not even of interest to the auditor how many personalities the awake, aberrated individual has assumed or can manifest. In the basic engram, he will find that the personality is integrated, that the individual is within himself. And by following up by careful steps the engram chain, along any and all dynamics, the auditor will continually reintegrate the individual until he is at last in present time as an integrated being, the analytical mind, the I, being in entire command and possession of the individual. As the analytical mind also contains the basic personality of the individual for purposes of this illustration, and as that basic personality is good and does obey all the dynamics implicitly, and is the personality with which the individual will be most happy and successful. The auditor need pay no attention to the number of times that personality has been split or depressed, beyond his initial diagnosis, which will permit him to reach the basic engram. The basic engram is quite locatable, actually, since it will respond very easily to this therapy, in addition to containing the individual as himself, feeling his own pains and consistently within himself throughout the recountings. In an aberrated personality, the basic engram is most usually prenatal and requires considerable patience and development in order to again approach the time track and become available to the analytical mind and so become exhausted. When he has approached the tone 4 of the basic personality, or even before he has approached it, the auditor will ordinarily discover that his preclear is beginning to laugh. The laughter will often appear very hysterical, since it is the laughter of relief. Laughter is apparently rejection, and this laughter is the analytical mind finding at length the falsity of the information which it was forced to use in its computations. Not only will the analytical mind force out of its circuits with such laughter all the erroneous information, it will also break automatically all the entirely mentally painful incidents related to that engram or to that engram chain. Even during the breaking of the basic engram, this laughter may often be found to approach the hysterical. This can be explained as a reversal of charge, as the analytical mind discovers the unworthiness of the engrammic content. After the first engram chain was broken, preclears have been found to laugh for several hours as they were paced up and down their time track looking for locks. These locks often vanish so swiftly they cannot be recounted. Such is the power of the analytical mind. The laughter is not necessarily part of the clearing process, but unless laughter is present, the basic engram most certainly has not been reached. If the engram which the auditor considers the basic has been lifted to a certain degree, and laughter has not resulted, it is not the basic engram, and an earlier incident removed from the time track must be located. So great is the power and fantastic ability of the analyzer, that part of the I which can pose to itself its own problems on imaginary environments and evolve entirely original and heretofore unimagined problems and solutions, that it can clear automatically all the future locks from the moment of the engram's receipt without further address by the auditor, beyond some prompting with the engrammic words. The clear is no longer being multi-commanded, but is integrated under the competent command of the basic personality. His analytical mind has had to form various complex, intricate, and strange circuits in order to cope with the organism's aberrated belief in the dangers inherent in certain restimulators. As soon as the basic engram has been reached, and its immediate chain exhausted, the analytical mind will begin to exhaust itself of all pertinent information and data. Accompanying engrams will achieve a similar result. The definition of a clear is that he is no longer interested in his own mind. He extroverts rather than introverts. His analytical mind no longer makes errors in simple computations, but can, with its new area which has been released by the locks, thus increasing the intelligence of the individual immeasurably, resolve problems it could not heretofore approach. The clear is not the product of destroyed personalities, but is the integration of the very best and the happiest portion of the individual. It is an error to suppose that any personality has been killed. Painful moments in the preclear's life have been exhausted, and certain individuals whom the preclear has dramatized, if they were painful to or antagonistic to the individual, are no longer present. But the basic personality is rehabilitated in its fullest and most intelligent and purposeful extent. The creation of a clear depends on restoring to the individual his self-determinism. The analytical mind and the I are fully capable of self-determinism. The doctrine of automatic determinism is false, erroneous, and degrading. The clear may be interested in clearing other individuals, since that is a portion of his four dynamics, but he will cease to be interested in the condition of his own mind the moment it is smoothly workable and in command of the organism. That mind can then solve the organism's problems in the environment, can solve the environment, can solve the problems of the entities which the organism has in its charge, and can, in short, command and create at will. When an engram has vanished, it can no longer be recalled along the engrammic track of the individual, and the incident is stored in the memory banks, as having been recounted to the auditor. The character of the clear is best delineated in the auditor's code. Every individual has his own basic personality, and at the age of 2 has formed his entire purpose for life. The reactive mind has only succeeded in substituting false and detrimental personalities and in warping the purpose of the individual. It has not in any degree injured the analytical mind. Whenever an individual possesses an engram chain which makes the suggestion that he must not get rid of something, he will attempt to hold on to his aberrations. He is reacting solely to an engramic command and is thinking in identities. A clear is not confused with such matters, for he well recognizes with the fabulous power of his analyzer that painfully inflicted exterior determinisms were of no aid to the organism. Every engram contains the perceptic that the analytical mind must be cut out of the circuit and nullified. This comes about because the engram was received into the reactive mind in moments when great shock or poisons, even when in the form of drugs, deadened or momentarily cut out of the circuit the analytical mind. That the analytical mind can be cut out of the circuit is in itself a survival mechanism, since any organism as sensitive and as complex as the analytical mind must, perforce, be equipped with some fuse mechanism. This then becomes one of the perceptics of organic sensation in any engram. Therefore, when engrams are being dramatized, the analytical mind is instantly lowered in potential even beyond the lowered potential which permitted the engram to become reactive. This is the character of convulsions and so forth. It is therefore possible for some chronically restimulated engram to hold the analytical mind in a suppressed state, such as chronic shock, chronic poisoning, or chronic sleep. As these and other things which tend to nullify the analytical mind or reduce its potential are restimulated into dramatization by restimulators in the environment of the individual, the potential of the analytical mind is reduced to a point where it may often appear that the individual is in a chronic trance state. A complete trance of the analytical mind and a chronic restimulation into dramatization of an engram are the commonest forms of insanity. But any series of engrams contains as part of its restimulative suggestion the reduction of the analytical mind in its activity. This is a soldered circuit from the engram. Therefore, when a clear is obtained, the analytical mind is for the first time fully alert. Its circuits are cleared, and it can form new thought patterns and can obtain an accuracy of computation which is amazing to watch. The clear is the entire being in rationality. He will not harm anything unless rational observation of a situation and the requirements of a society demand that such a thing be harmed. A clear is relaxed in a fully conscious state, untroubled by aberrated fears. He is as fully aware of the world around him as an ecstatic child would be, and is possessed of a rationality based upon his experience. Painful experience is stored reliably and accurately in his banks as reliable data, but engramic and unconscious experience is eradicated as unreliable and erroneous data. Freudian psychology addressed the problem of attempting to clear an individual through examining and rationalizing the lock content of the analytical mind. Considerable alleviation may be attempted after a considerable labor by any such method, but the engrams still remain, and the engrams can still be restimulated, thus forming a new problem for such a therapy. Treatments which tend to blast locks out of the analytical mind tend to further reduce the dynamics of the individual and destroy the basic personality. For dynamic alone may hold an individual in balance, and dynamic alone makes him valuable to himself and his community. A clear is rehabilitated in his dynamics, and these will be found to be strengthened immeasurably. He is better able to solve the problems of his environment, and has available to him more circuits for such computation. He is able to control the organism and its various functions, and is an integrated unit. He is rational and constructive. His self-determinism has been rehabilitated to the final degree, and he is no longer subjected to reaction from environmental stimuli, which is characteristic of the base and fumbly animal over which man has triumphed after fully 1,000,000 years of evolution. Part 3. Clearing. Chapter 15. Engram Chains. More than one engram chain will be found in every aberree. When he becomes a preclear, the auditor does well to discover the earliest engram chain. It is not always possible to do this with accuracy, since a preclear is sometimes in such a nervous condition that he cannot be worked on his basic chain, but must be alleviated in a greater or lesser degree by the exhaustion of a later and more available chain. This last, however, is not the usual case. The auditor should clearly understand certain working principles and definitions. By an engram is meant a moment of unconsciousness accompanied by physical pain and conceived antagonism. There are two classes of engrams. One is the basic engram, which is the earliest engram on an engram chain. The other is the engram lock, which is an engram of the same character and kind, on the same dynamic as the basic engram of the chain. An engram chain is then composed of a basic engram and a series of engram locks. Engram chains also contain ordinary locks, which are instances of mental anguish more or less known to the analytical mind. These are often mistaken by the preclear for the cause of his conduct. A true engram is unknown to the conscious computer of the preclear, but underlies it as a false datum on which is erected almost equally unknown engram locks and an enormous number of locks. In order to release an engram chain, it is vital and absolutely necessary to discover the engrams of that chain. An individual may have more than one engram chain, but he has a basic engram chain. This must be cleared as soon as possible after auditing is engaged on the preclear. When an engram is discovered by the auditor, he must examine the aspect of it to determine whether or not it is the basic. Discovering it is not, he must immediately determine an earlier basic, and so forth, until he is obviously on the scene of the basic engram. There are certain tests which he can apply. A basic engram will rise to laughter, sag slightly, and then rise to tone 4 and vanish. Successive engrams will then erase from that chain with very little work. Almost any engram on an engram chain can be exhausted. But if it is an engram lock and not a basic engram, it will recede and vanish at times, but will rise in part again when the basic engram has been reached and the preclear is brought forward into its area. An engram lock is subject to sag, which is to say that it may be brought to the 2.0 tone. But after a certain length of time has elapsed, from 1 to 2 days, it will be found to have sagged and to be, for instance, in a 1.1 tone. It can be successively lifted until it is apparently in a 3.0 tone, at which point much of its content will disappear. This is an alleviation. Any engram chain can be alleviated to some degree without reaching the basic. But when the basic has been reached, the basic itself and subsequent engram locks can be brought rapidly to tone 4, providing no engram locks are skipped on the return up the time track. When an engram chain has been brought to tone 4, it can be considered to have vanished, although while the preclear can no longer find it on the time track, he may even be unable to recall some of its most painful and disheartening aspects. The mind apparently has been proofed against the data it has contained. A search for an engram chain after it has been exhausted and a tone 4 has been achieved should, for purposes of auditing, be entirely fruitless. Once the basic has been discovered and the engram chain has been brought to tone 4, the locks will vanish of their own accord. If this does not occur, then there is something remaining, or the auditor has been too optimistic about the selection of his basic engram for the chain, and has not in reality discovered it. All engram chains should be exhausted from a preclear. These may be discovered to lie along the various dynamics, but any chain may influence more than one dynamic. Another type of engram is the cross engram. This is usually a childhood or adult engram which embraces more than one engram chain. The receipt of the cross engram, containing as it does the convergence of 2 or more engram chains, is often accompanied by a nervous breakdown or the sudden insanity of an individual. A cross engram may occur in a severe accident, in prolonged or severe illness under antagonistic circumstances, or, for instance, in a nitrous oxide operation. Cross engrams are very easy to locate, but should not be addressed by the auditor as such, since an enormous amount of work upon them will not exhaust them until the basics and the engram chains on which the cross engram depends have been brought to tone 4. Post-battle neurasthenia is almost always traceable to the receipt of a cross engram. This must, of course, be an engram in its own right, as well as an engram lock on more than one chain. It is conceivable that an engram lock may be so severe that it breaks the individual, even if it lies on only one engram chain. There are certain rules the auditor may employ to establish the basic engram of an engram chain. In first entering a case, these rules apply as well to the first goal of the auditor, which is the location of the basic engram of the basic engram chain. 1. No engram will lift if the basic of that chain has not been lifted. 2. The basic engram will not lift until the basic instant of the basic engram has been reached, which is to say, the first moment of the engram. Ordinarily, this is the most obscure. 3. If after 2 or 3 test recountings of an engram it does not seem to be improving, the auditor should attempt to discover an earlier engram. 4. No engram is valid unless accompanied by somatic pain. This may be mild. Incidents which do not contain somatics are either not basics, the pain having been suspended by some such command as "can't feel" in the basic, or else it may not even be an engram. Cases should be entered as near as possible to the basic engram. Then, they should be returned to earlier incidents until the basic is discovered. The treatment of locks themselves may accomplish some alleviation of a case. In view of what can be accomplished by the treatment of engrams, such a gain is not worth consideration by an auditor. Locks should be examined only to discover discrepancies of conduct, which will lead to some character of an earlier engram. Chapter 16. Dramatization. Dramatization is the duplication of an engramic content, entire or in part, in his present time environment by an aberree. Aberrated conduct is entirely dramatization. Aberrated conduct will occur only when and if an engram exists in the reactive mind of the aberree. That conduct will be a duplication of such an engram. The degree of dramatization is in direct ratio to the degree of restimulation of the engrams causing it. A mild dramatization would be a similarity to the engram. A severe dramatization would be an identity with the engram. When his person is unwearied and he is well and not directly menaced in his environment, the tone level of the entire individual possesses too great a differential from the tone level of the engram, which is always low on the tone scale. As the general tone of the individual approaches the tone level of the engram under restimulation, dramatization becomes more severe. The analytical mind is present to the degree that the general tone of the aberree is high. As this general tone lowers through ill health, reverses, or constant restimulation of the reactive mind, the analytical mind is proportionately less aware. Dramatization is demonstrated by the aberree in inverse ratio to the potential of the analytical mind. A geometrical progression is entered, as general tone lowers, to cause the analytical mind to lose its entire awareness potential. Since every engram contains, as the common denominator of all engrams, the unconsciousness of the organ which is the analytical mind, dramatizations bounce rapidly as this interaction progresses. In the presence of a relatively high analytical mind awareness potential, dramatization takes the form of similarity. The data of the engram is present, but is interspersed with or modified by justified thought. The physical pain, which is always present as part of the dramatization, is an equally mild duplication of the pain which was present during the engram. The awareness potential of the analytical mind reduces in the restimulation of the engram, which again reduces the general tone. The aberree is subject to almost continuous dramatization of one engram or another as the restimulators appear in his vicinity, although the aberration may be so mild as to include only some chronically affected organ. Complete dramatization is complete identity. It is the engram in full force in present time, with the aberree taking one or more parts of the dramatis personae present in the engram. He may dramatize all the actors or merely one of them. His dramatization is identity, is unreasoned, and always entirely reactive. When the analytical mind reaches the low point of awareness potential it held during the engrammic incident, that point is also forced upon the aberree as a part of the dramatization. The aberree may also dramatize himself as he was at the moment of the engram's receipt. The words, physical actions, expressions, and emotions of an aberree undergoing an identity dramatization are those of the single or various dramatis personae present in the engram. An engram which can be dramatized may at any time in an aberree's future be dramatized as an identity dramatization when and if his general tone is low and his environment becomes infiltrated by restimulators. An aberree, because of high general tone and other factors, may not suffer the restimulation of an engram for a number of years after its receipt. A large number of engrams may be present and undramatized in any aberree if he has never been presented with their particular restimulators in an optimum moment for restimulation. The common denominator of all insanity is the absence of all, or almost all, awareness potential in the analytical mind. Insanity can be acute or chronic. Any identity dramatization is insanity, by which is meant the entire absence of rationality. The aberree commonly and chronically dramatizes locks. The engrammic content may compel or repress the aberree whenever restimulated. An irrational person is irrational to the degree that he dramatizes or succumbs to engrammic content in his reactive mind. The computations which can be made on the basis of dramatization are infinite. The reactive mind thinks in identities. Dramatizations are severe as they approach identities with the engrams, which force them into being in the conduct of the aberree. The auditor can profit in many ways by these principles of dramatization. By examination of the rage or apathy or hysteria patterns of the preclear, the auditor will find himself in possession of the exact character of the engrams for which he is searching. In the case of the manic, the fanatic, or the zealot, an engram has entirely blocked at least one of the purpose lines deriving from a dynamic. This engram may be called an assist engram. Its own surcharge, not the dynamic force, leads the individual to believe that he has a high purpose which will permit him to escape pain. This purpose is a false purpose, not ordinarily sympathetic with the organism, having a hectic quality derived from the pain which is part of it, even though that pain is not wittingly experienced. This assist engram is using the native ability of the organism to accomplish its false purpose, and brings about a furious and destructive effort on the part of the individual who without this assist engram could have better accomplished the same goal. The worst feature of the assist engram is that the effort it commands is engrammic dramatization of a particular sort. And if the engram itself is restimulated, the individual becomes subject to the physical pain and fear which the entire experience contained. Therefore, the false purpose itself is subject to sporadic sag. This sag becomes longer and longer in duration between periods of false thrust. It is easy to confuse in casual observation an assist engram and an actual valid dynamic, unless one also observes the interspersed periods of sag. The assist engram may or may not occasionally accomplish something, but it does accomplish a confusion in the society that the dynamics of the individual are derived from his bad experiences. This is a thing which is emphatically untrue. Inherently, the individual has great willpower. This, however, can be aberrated. Willpower or its absence occasions the attitude of the aberree toward his reactive mind. The prevention of the dramatization of an engram or a lock further reduces the dynamic of the aberree. Chronic prevention lowers his general tone toward the breakpoint. Unhampered dramatization, as it contains restimulation of a physical pain and the reduced potential of the analytical mind, produces other harmful effects. Necessity can and does render inactive the entire reactive mind. Dramatization occurs most often in the absence of necessity, or when the reactive mind has obscured the presence of necessity. Dramatization is residual in the motor controls, including speech, and can be allayed by the physical exhaustion of the individual. The organism during dramatization tends to revivify toward the moment of the engram's occurrence. The engram containing, as one of its identity parts, the complete physical condition of the organism as at the moment of receiving the engram. There is no folly or facet of human activity which cannot be dramatized. An immediate alleviation can be achieved when addressing an aboree who is in identity dramatization by acting upon the fact that the conditions of auditing, with one exception, already exist, i.e., the pre-clear return to the moment of occurrence. Affinity may be established and Dianetic auditing begun at once. He can be persuaded to listen for the phrases he is uttering, and they can be alleviated by exhaustion on routine procedure. Chapter 17. Prenatal, Birth, and Infant Engrams. The human mind and the human anatomy are enormously more powerful and resilient than has commonly been supposed. Only incidents of the greatest magnitude in physical pain and hostile content are sufficient to aberrate a mind. The ability of the mind to store data can scarcely be overrated. In early life, before sound is analyzed as speech, a human being receives and stores exact impressions of everything which occurs. At some future date, when similar perceptics are encountered, the reactive mind reanalyzes, on the basis of identities only, the content of the early mind. This becomes the foundation of the post-conception personality. The actual personality in the individual is powerful and very difficult to aberrate. Unlike animals, which can be driven mad by minor mechanisms of experimental psychology, a man must be most severely handled before he begins to show any signs of derangement. That derangement proceeds from the ability of the reactive mind to store perceptions from the earliest moments of existence and retain them on either the analytical or the reactive plane for future reference. The basic personality does not proceed from engrams, and the dynamics of the individual are impeded, not enhanced by engrams. The dynamics are entirely separate and are as native to the individual as his basic personality, of which they are a part. Information falls into two categories: the educational, or experience level banked and available to the analytical mind on at least its deeper levels, and aberrational, or data stored in the reactive mind and often used by, but never reached by, the analytical mind, save through auditing. There would seem to be two types of recording. The first is cellular recording, in which the cells would seem to store data. In that cells in procreating become themselves again, which is to say that when cell A divides, both halves are still cell A. Cellular intelligence is not lost. Personal identity is duplicated. In the case of individual men, procreation is far more complex, and individual identity is lost. The son is not the father, but a genetic composite of vast numbers of ancestors. The cells of the human being shortly after conception are capable of enormous perceptic and retentive power. After a very short time in the womb, the brain and nervous system are already operating. From then until birth, the human being is apparently capable of computations of a rather complex nature on the analytical mind level. Far more certainly, he retains information on the reactive level. Fear, pain, and unconsciousness extend the range of perception of the individual. When the human being in the womb is injured, his senses extend so as to record sounds outside the mother's body. He records them so well that their precise nature is stored for future reference. The human being in the womb responds exactly as it does after birth to the receipt of engrams, storing the data with precision and reacting to it. The repair facilities available to a human being before birth are greatly enhanced by the presence of ample connective tissue, oxygen, and sustenance. These repair facilities are unimaginably great, so that a prenatal human being can be severely torn and ripped without becoming structurally deficient. It does, however, receive engrams, and these engrams are subject to restimulation. In many cases of attempted abortions, it was found that large sections of the prenatal human being's brain could apparently be injured without the brain being deficient or even scarred after birth. These repair facilities do not, however, lessen the extreme severity of the engrams which can be received by the prenatal human being. The word fetus is dropped at this point, and it is advised that it should be dropped from the language as a description of a pre-birth human being. Insufficient evidence is at hand to make an outright declaration that attempted abortions are responsible for the bulk of our criminal and insane aborrees. But according to the cases at hand, the attempted abortion must be accounted responsible for the majority. The attempted abortion is the most serious aberration producer. So exact is the recording of the pre-birth human being, or prenatal, that the reactive mind makes no errors in recognizing its enemies after birth. The mind becomes aberrated in having to depend upon these same enemies for the ordinary sustenance of life while the child is a helpless infant. The diagnosis of a prenatal case is relatively simple. Nearly all preclears will be found to have at least one prenatal engram, and the case will not solve unless that prenatal is reached and exhausted. The auditor can usually establish the attempted abortion preclear by an investigation of the conduct of the infant and child. Uneasiness or unhappiness in the home, a feeling of not being wanted, unreasonable fear and a strong attachment to grandparents or another non-parental member of the household are often signs of an attempted abortion. Fear of the dark is usually, but not always, a part of the attempted abortion case. The auditor should suspect an abortion attempt in every preclear he audits, at least for this next generation. Whether or not the preclear disbelieves the diagnosis is of no importance to the auditor, as the prenatal engrams may very well contain the words, "can't believe it." The parents themselves, as well as society, mislead the individual as to the enormous prevalence at this time of this practice. The attempted abortion preclear may not be discovered to be such until considerable auditing has already been done. Any auditing done on an attempted abortion preclear, unless it is solely addressed to making the case workable, is wasted until the attempted abortions are reached. The post-birth aborree presents a somewhat different case than the prenatal, since his case can be entered at any point, and the earliest moments of it can be attained easily. This is not true of the attempted abortion preclear. Attempted abortions may run to any number, since they are easily the most prevalent dramatization of engram in the society. They are repeated time and again. The auditor will find it necessary to unstack the prenatal period. He will ordinarily reach the latest prenatal injury first. As he finds and examines it, it places itself on the time track. By continuous returning to earlier and earlier attempts, more and more of these engrams are revealed, until at last the earliest is discovered. The auditor must be prepared to spend many hours of hard work in unstacking injuries. He will many times believe that he has reached the basic of that engram chain, only to discover that another type of abortion was attempted prior to that moment. He need not address these engrams for any length of time before he goes on to the earlier one. He should only get some idea of them, so that they will be easily locatable on the return. The basic engram on the attempted abortion case may be found shortly after the first missed period of the mother. Its emotion will be exactly that of the person or persons attempting to perform the abortion. The prenatal human being identifies himself with himself, but an adult, returned to the prenatal period, is reinterpreting the data and will find that he has and is confusing himself with other people associated in the attempts. This engramic data may have slumbered for years before it became violently restimulated, and may indeed never have been awakened. It must be removed, however, before a clear can be obtained. The auditor should be prepared to unstack 50 or more incidents before birth, if necessary. When he is at last in the vicinity of the basic, even the most skeptical preclear, one who has skepticism as part of the prenatal engram chains, will have no further question as to what is happening to him. The auditor should be prepared to encounter difficulty in the ability of the preclear to hear voices or feel pain, as it is quite common for the engramic content to contain such phrases as unconscious and can't see, can't feel, can't hear. This having been the misconception of the society regarding prenatal life. The auditor should never be appalled at the damage the prenatal human being has received, and so question the validity of his preclear's data. Unless the umbilical cord is severed or the heart is stopped, it is apparently the case that no damage, particularly in the earlier months, is too great for the organism to reconstruct. In that parents performing abortions are usually dramatizing attempted abortions which have been performed on them, Rationality of content in the engrams should not be expected. Even the data given for it by the abortionists, father, mother, or professional, is often entirely inaccurate. The test of an engram is whether or not it will lift, and whether or not the somatics which accompanied it disappear and a tone 4 is obtained. Rearranging data into other sequences will not obtain this. The exact content must be brought out. If the prenatal human being's recording mechanism was so disturbed that it did not, at some period in the attempt, record, then there is no engram for the blank period only. But this is a theoretical case only. There has not been one yet discovered. The attempted abortion human being is often struck unconscious by the earliest part of each attempt, since the head is so available to the knitting needles, hat pins, orange wood sticks, button hooks, and so forth which are employed. These periods of unconsciousness must be penetrated, and will quite ordinarily release slowly. The number of prenatal engrams should not particularly appall the auditor, for when the basic has been discovered and a tone 4 achieved, the succeeding experiences will lift with greater and greater ease. The periods of unconsciousness interspersed between the prenatal engrams, being locks, will vanish. Birth is, in itself, a severe experience, and is recorded by the human being from the first moments of pain throughout the entire experience. Everything in a birth is engramic, since the human being conceives the ministrations to be more or less antagonistic, since they are accompanied by so much pain. A birth must be lifted as a matter of course, but not until the presence or absence of prenatals has been established. Even after birth has been lifted, prenatals should be looked for, since prenatals may often be found only after birth has been exhausted. The habits of obstetricians, the presence of sound and speech in the delivery room, the swabbing of an infant's nostrils, the examination of its mouth, the severe treatment administered to start its breathing, and the drops in the eyes may account in themselves for many psychosomatic ills. A cough, however, although it is present in birth and seems to be alleviated by the exhaustion of the birth engram, is quite ordinarily blood running down the throat of the prenatal during an attempted abortion. Any perception during birth, when difficulty is encountered with breathing, may become a restimulator for asthma. Clean fresh air and electric lights may cause allergies and may be the principal restimulators. Everything said during birth, as well as everything said during prenatal engrams, is recorded in the reactive mind and acts as aberrational matter which can and does cause psychological and physiological changes in the individual. Because the parents are not greatly in evidence at birth, this experience may not be restimulated for many years. Prenatals, on the other hand, restimulate more easily. Infant life is very sentient. Delay in learning to talk is delay in learning the complexity of handling vocal muscles rather than a delay in ability to record. Everything in infant life is recorded, and the engrams received in it are extremely valid. The auditor will find himself dealing mainly with prenatal, birth, and infant life. The cases are very rare which have many important basics in childhood or adult life. These last periods contain mainly engram locks, which, though they must be addressed to create the clear, should not engage much initial attention on the part of the auditor. Most of the experiences of mental anguish in childhood and adult life are founded on very early engrams and are locks, which are self-removing. Moments of unconsciousness which contain physical pain and conceived antagonism lying in childhood and adult life are serious and can produce aberration. Engram chains complete with basic may be found, which will all by themselves exhaust. But little, if any, actual aberration comes after the 5th year is reached. Chapter 18. The Laws of Returning. By aberration is meant the pre-clear's reactions to and difficulties with his current environment. By somatic is meant any physical or physically sensory abnormality which the pre-clear manifests generally or sporadically in his environment, or any such manifestation encountered and re-experienced in the process of auditing. The aberration is the mental error caused by engrams, and the somatic is the physical error occasioned by the same source. The auditor follows the general rule that no aberrations or somatics exist in a preclear which cannot be accounted for by engrams. He may ordinarily be expected to discover that anything which reduces the physical or mental perfection of the preclear is engramic. He applies this rule first, and in practice admits no organic trouble of any character. Only when he has obviously obtained a clear, and when he has observed and medically examined that clear, after a period of 60 days to 6 months from end of auditing, should he be content to assign anything to organic origin. He cannot be expected to know, until the final examination, exactly what somatic was not engramic. In other words, he must persistently adhere to one line of thought, that the preclear can be brought to mental and physical perfection, before he resigns any mental or physical error in the preclear to a purely organic category. Too little is known at this writing of the recoverability of the mind and body for an auditor to deny that ability to recover. Since primary research, considerable practice has demonstrated that this ability to reconstruct and recover is enormous, far beyond anything previously conceived possible. Dianetics accounts for all faith-healing phenomena on an entirely scientific basis, and the auditor can expect himself to consort daily in his practice with what appear to be miracles. In addition to knowledge of his subject, considerable intelligence and imagination, and a personality which inspires confidence, the auditor must possess persistency to a remarkable degree. In other words, his dynamics must be phenomenally high. There is no substitute for the auditor having been cleared. It is possible for an individual to operate with Dianetics without having been cleared, and he may do so for some time without repercussion. But as he practices, he will most certainly encounter the perceptics contained in some of his own engrams, time after time, until these engrams are so restimulated that he will become mentally or physically ill. In psychoanalysis, it was possible for the analyst to escape this fate because he dealt primarily with locks occurring in the post-speech life. The analyst might even experience relief from operating on patients, since it might clarify his own locks, which are, and more or less always had been, completely available to his analytical mind. This is very far from the case with the auditor, who handles continually the vital and highly charged data which cause physical and mental aberrations. An auditor in Dianetics may work with impunity for a very short time only before his own condition demands that he himself be cleared of his engrams. While this is aside from the main subject of auditing, it has been too often observed to be neglected. Every engram possesses some quality which denies it to the analytical mind. There are roughly 4 types of denial. First, there is the self-locking engram, which contains the species of phrases, "Frank will never know about this," "forget it," "cannot remember it," and so forth. Second is the self-invalidating engram, which contains the species of the phrases, "never happened," "can't believe it," "wouldn't possibly imagine it," and so on. Third is the preclear ejection engram, which contains the species of phrases, "can't stay here," "get out," and other phrases which will not permit the preclear to remain in its vicinity, but return him to present time. The fourth is the preclear seizing engram, which contains the species of phrases, "stay here," "hold still," "can't get out," and so on. These 4 are the general types which the auditor will find to occasion him the greatest difficulty. The type of phrase being encountered, however, is easily diagnosed from preclear reaction. There are many other types of engrams and species of phrases which will be encountered. There is the self-perpetuating engram, which implies that "it will always be this way," and "it happens all the time." The auditor will soon learn to recognize them, forming lists of his own. An engram would not be an engram unless it had strong compulsive or repressive data contained in it. All engrams are self-locking to some degree, being well off the time track and touching it slightly, if at all, with some minor and apparently innocuous bit of information which the analytical mind disregards as unimportant. Classed with the self-locking specific variety are those phrases which deny perception of any kind. The auditor will continually encounter perception denial, and will find it one of the primary reasons the preclear cannot recall and articulate the engram. Can't see, can't hear, can't feel, and isn't alive tend to self-lock the whole engram containing any such phrases. As the engram is a powerful surcharge of physical pain, it will, without any phrases whatsoever, deny itself to the analytical mind, which, in seeking to scan it, is repelled by its operating principle that it must avoid pain for the organism. As has already been covered, there are 5 ways the organism can handle a source of pain. It can neglect it, attack it, succumb to it, flee from it, or avoid it. As the entire organism handles exterior pain sources, so does the analytical mind tend to react to engrams. There is an exterior world reaction of the organism to pain sources then. This is approximated when the analytical mind is addressed in regard to engrams. There is an excellent reason for this. Everything contained in the reactive mind is exterior source material. The analytical mind was out of circuit and was recording imperfectly, if at all, in the time period when the exterior source was entered into the reactive mind. An analytical mind, when asked to approach an engram, reacts as it would have had it been present, which is to say, out of circuit at the moment when the engram was being received. Therefore, an approach to the engram must be made which will permit the auditor to direct the preclear's analytical mind into but one source of action: attack. The actual incident must be located and re-experienced. In that the analytical mind has 5 possible ways of reacting to the engram, and in that the auditor desires that only one of these, attack, be used, the preclear must be persuaded from using the remaining 4. On this general principle can be created many types of approach to the problem of obtaining a clear. The one which is offered in this manual is that one which is met with quicker and more predictable results than others researched. It has given, in use, 100% results in obtaining clears. In the beginning, at this time, an auditor should not attempt to stray far from this offered technique. He should attempt to vary it only when he himself has had extensive and sufficient practice, which will enable him to be very conversant with the nature of engrams. Better techniques will undoubtedly be established, which will provide swifter exhaustion of the reactive mind. See Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health, the complete handbook of Dianetic procedure. The offered technique has produced results in all types of cases so far encountered. There are 3 equations which demonstrate how and why the auditor in preclear can reach engrams and exhaust them. 1. The auditor's dynamics are equal to or less than the engramic surcharge in the preclear. 2. The preclear's dynamics are less than the engramic surcharge. 3. The auditor's dynamics plus preclear's dynamics are greater than the engramic surcharge. When the preclear's dynamics are entirely or almost entirely reduced, the auditor's dynamics are not always sufficient to force the preclear's analytical mind into an attack upon the engram. The auditor's dynamics directed against an engram in a preclear who has not been subjected to a process which will inhibit the free play of his reactive mind and concentrate it, ordinarily provokes the preclear into one of the 4 unusable methods of succumbing, fleeing, avoiding, or neglecting the engram. Demanding that the preclear face reality, or see reason, or that he stop his foolish actions, fall precisely into this category. The auditor's dynamics operating against a preclear can produce a break, temporary or of considerable duration, in the preclear. When the preclear is in reverie, some of his own dynamics are present, and the auditor's dynamics added to these make a combination sufficient to overcome the engramic surcharge. If the auditor releases his dynamics against the analytical mind of the preclear, which is to say the person of the preclear, while an attempt is being made to reach an engram, in violation of the auditor's code or with some erroneous idea that the whole person of the preclear is confronting him, the auditor will receive in return all the fury of the engramic surcharge. An engram can be dramatized innumerable times, for such is the character of the reactive mind that the surcharge of the engram cannot exhaust itself, and will not exhaust itself, regardless of its age or the number of times dramatized, until it has been approached by the analytical mind of the preclear. The additive dynamic law must be made to apply before engrams are reached. It is very occasionally necessary to change Dianetic auditors, for some preclears will work well only with either a male or a female auditor, or with one or another individual auditor. This will not be found necessary in many cases. 3 cases are on record where the pre-clear was definitely antipathetic toward the auditor throughout the entire course of auditing. The auditor was found to be a restimulator for one or more of the persons contained in the engrams. Even so, these people were cleared. Greater patience was required on the part of the auditor. Closer observance of the auditor's code was necessary, and a longer time was required for auditing. It will be discovered that once the pre-clear understands what is desired of him and why, his basic personality is aroused to the extent that it will cooperate with any auditor in order to be free. It will suffer through many violations of the auditor's code. Once a pre-clear has been entered upon auditing, he will ordinarily continue to cooperate in the major requirements to the fullest extent, no matter what apparent antagonisms he may display in minor matters. The fact that the auditor is interested solely in what has been done to the pre-clear, and is not at all interested in what the pre-clear himself has done to others, greatly facilitates therapy, since there is no social disgrace in having been an unwitting victim. The pre-clear is placed in a light state of concentration, which is not to be confused with hypnosis. In the state of alliance, therefore, the mind of the pre-clear will be found to be, to some degree, detachable from his surroundings and directed interiorly. The first thing that the auditor will discover in most pre-clears is aberration of the sense of time. There are various ways that he can circumvent this and construct a time track along which he can cause the pre-clear's mind to travel. Various early experiences, which are easily reached, are examined, and an early diagnosis can be formed. Then begins an immediate effort to reach basic, with attempted abortion or prenatal accident predominating. Failures on the first attempts to reach prenatal experiences should not discourage the auditor, since many hours may be consumed and many false basics reached and exhausted before the true prenatal basic is attained. The auditor can use and will observe certain apparently natural laws in force. They are as follows. 1. The difficulties the analytical mind encounters when returned to or searching for an engram are identical to the command content of that engram. 2. A pre-clear in adult life is more or less obeying, as restimulated, the composite experiences contained in his engrams. 3. The pre-clear's behavior in returning is regulated by the commands contained in the engram to which he is returned, and is modified by the composite of chronologically preceding engrams on his time track. 4. The somatics of a pre-clear are at their highest in an engram where they were received, and at the moment of reception in that experience. 5. When returned prior to an engram, the commands and somatics of that engram are not effective on the pre-clear. As he is returned to the moment of an engram, the pre-clear experiences, as the common denominator of all engrams, a considerable lessening of his analytical potential. He speaks and acts in a modified version of the engram. All complaints he makes to the auditor should be regarded as possibly being verbatim from, first, the engram that he is re-experiencing, or second, from prior engrams. 6. At the precise moment of an engrammic command, the pre-clear experiences obedience to that command. The emotion a pre-clear experiences when returned to an engram is identical to the emotional tone of that engram. Excesses of emotion will be found to be contained in the word content of the engram as commands. 7. When a pre-clear is returned before the moment of reception of an engram, he is not subject to any part of that engram emotionally, aberrationally, or somatically. 8. When the time track is found to contain loops, or is blurred in any of its portion, its crossings or confusions are directly attributable to engrammic commands which precisely state the confusion. 9. Any difficulty a pre-clear may experience with returning, reaching engrams, perceiving, or recounting are directly and precisely commanded by engrams. 10. An engram would not be an engram were it easy to reach, gave the pre-clear no difficulty, and contained no physical pain. 11. The characteristic of engrams is confusion. First, the confusion of the time track. Second, the confusion of an engram chain, wherein similar words or somatics mix incidents. Third, confusion of incidents with engrams. This confusion is occasioned by the disconnected state of the analytical mind during the receipt of the engram. 12. Auditing by location and identification of hidden incidents. First, rebuilds at least the early part of the time track, locates and fixes engrams in relation to one another in time, and then locates the basic of the basic chain and exhausts it. The remainder of the chain must also be exhausted. The engram locks exhaust with ease after the erasure of the basic engram or the basic of any chain within that chain. Locks vanish without being located. A tone 4 gained on basic permits the subsequent erasure on the time track to go forward with ease. A whole chain may rise to 4 without the basic chain having been located. 13. Any perception of pre-speech life during returning connotates the existence of engramic experience as far back as the time track is open. 14. If the individual's general tone is not clearly tone 4, if he is still interested in his engrams, another more basic chain than the one found still exists. 15. Engram patterns tend to form an avoidance pattern for the preclear. From basic outward, there is an observable and progressive divergence between the preclear himself and his return self. In the basic engram of the basic chain, and for a few subsequent engrams on that chain, he will be found within himself and receiving the experiences as himself. In subsequent engrams, cleavage is observable, and in late engrams, the preclear is found to be observing the action from the outside of himself, almost as a disinterested party. This forms the principal primary test for the basic of the basic chain. 16. Another test for basic is sag. Any engram may be exhausted to a point where it will recede without reaching tone 4. Although it is temporarily and momentarily lost to the individual and apparently does not trouble him, that engram which has been exhausted in a chain without the basic having been reached will sag or reappear within 24 to 60 hours. Basic on any chain will not sag, but will lift on a number of recountings, rise to tone 4, and will remain erased. 17. Another test for basic is whether or not it begins to lift with ease. If an engram does not intensify or remain static after many recountings, it can be conceived to be at least a basic on some engram chain. 18. Locks will lift and disappear without returning, as they are not fixed in the body by physical pain. Large numbers of locks can be exhausted, bringing an alleviation of the preclear's difficulties, and such a course may occasionally be pursued in the entrance of a case. The discovery and lifting of the basic to which the locks are appended removes the locks automatically. These rules and laws, unless modified in their statement, will be found invariable. Incompetent auditing cannot be excused by the supposed discovery of a special case or exception. A physical derangement must be in the category of actually missing parts of the organism to cause permanent disability, and instances of this are not common.